in signal intensities, for example, peak heights, among the different contributors' alleles. In such instances, major and/or minor contributors may be determined. Discernment of the STR typing results for the major or minor contributors to a mixture may be limited to only some loci, in parentheses, with the remaining loci yielding multiple potential genotypes for the major or minor contributor.
No,
multiple potential genotypes for the major or minor contributor, close parentheses. The major, open parentheses, and possibly the minor, close parentheses, contributor may effectively constitute a deduced single source profile.
And deduced single source profile, that's a major profile.
That's correct.
So, according to the SWGDAM guidelines, what do you need to call a major?
You need to have peaks that are higher than other peaks in the profile.
Is that what you did when you called a major?
Yes.
How long have you been using that procedure?
Effectively 20 years.
Would you move ahead for me to page 14, staying on the subject of calling a minor. There is a section at the top of page 14, 4.3, and a subsection, 4.3.1. Can you read them both into the record for me?
4.3 and 4.3.1, or just 4.3.1?
4.3 and 4.3.1.
All right. 4.3, the laboratory must not use inconclusive/uninterpretable data, for example, at individual loci or an entire multi-locus profile in statistical analysis. 4.3.1, for a distinguishable mixture, a major contributor or contributor's profile may be suitable for statistical analysis even in the presence of inconclusive minor contributor results.
So if you have a mixture and you see an identifiable major, but there is other human DNA there that is inconclusive, can you still call a major according to that guideline?
Yes, sir, you can.
Can you think of a piece of evidence where you follow that guideline to the letter? How about RC1A?
RC1A, yes.
I want to ask you about likelihood ratios. There's been a lot of discussion about what you call, I guess the term we're all using is group hypothesis, this idea of considering all the people together in one statistical number. Do you recall what I'm talking about?
Yes.
I want to be clear for the court's benefit on how you do that. And if I can, I'm going to use another page.
RC1A is an evidence of Delancy's Exhibit 1.
I'm sorry?
RC1A is an evidence of Delancy's Exhibit 1.
Okay, thank you. I'll figure out what to do with that in a minute. And let me make sure I get my little hypothetical right. We're going to have 4 people. 250 RFU. C and D are at 3 loci. At 50. You can see that?
Yes.
Let's start with that. Tell me, please, how do you go about, if you've made an assessment to an electropherogram, and that's what you found, can you do a statistical analysis including all four in a group hypothesis?
You can, but you can only do it at the three loci that A, B, C, and D have in common. The additional, right, where A, B, C, and D are at those three loci that you've determined previously were all there. The other three loci where it's only A and B but not C and D, if you are asking the question, what is the likelihood of finding these four individuals rather than four random individuals, you could only use the three loci at which all four were there.
All right, but this is really good. I have 6 over here, right? Yes?
That's true.
This is going to give me a very, very, very high number, isn't it? Maybe.
Maybe.
All right? Don't I want to use all 6? I'm the prosecutor. I want to use all 6.
Well, sadly, as the scientist, I would tell you, I'm sure you would like to, but you don't get to.
Tell me again why?
Because if you've asked the question, and this is the beauty of the likelihood ratio, right? And it allows you to formulate multiple hypotheses and test them. So you could say that I'm only going to ask questions about A and B and use all 6. But if you want to know if your hypothesis is A, B, C, and D, well, then you can only use the three loci that all 4 are found completely at.
But this is at 6. I mean, I have to underreport A and B to do it?
Effectively, yes. You are underreporting A and B because you've asked a question, you've formulated a hypothesis that says, what is my likelihood of A, B, C, and D versus 4 unknowns? In that case, the only loci that provide probative evidence for all 4 are the 3 loci that all 4 share.
Okay, so let's say I do that. Okay, I follow the scientist example, much to my dismay, and I cross this out and I accept that I can only consider 3. Okay? And I'm asking the question now, and you're doing the math for all of them together, right?
All right.
Now, when I consider all 4 together, am I going to get a higher number than I would if I was only thinking of 1 alone? If I wanted to break somebody out, right? If I wanted to break out A by himself and just ask that question, if I break somebody out of that analysis, the numbers go down, right?
Yes. Effectively, what you're doing is you're assigning all of that known information to an unknown, right? Your hypothesis becomes 1 known and 3 unknowns over 4 unknowns. Well, effectively, you're taking all of that genetic data and assigning it to unknowns and asking, well, how much does this little piece of known actually generate? And in this particular instance, because you have allele assignments that have been determined to be completely there, then you're not exactly taking account of the data the way you should.
In other words, if I break somebody out, I'm not asking the same question anymore.
Correct. That's exactly.
If I want to know the likelihood of all 4 of them being there, there's only one way to do that, right?
That's correct.
Okay. And that means I have to give something up, but I get something in return.
That's correct.
This idea of a group hypothesis, of doing this, let me go back to the National Research Council. Do they have a section in NRC2, in the National Research Council report, talking about likelihood ratios?
Yes, they do.
Do they even give examples of how to do likelihood ratios?
They do.
Do they use a group hypothesis?
They use the group hypothesis.
Now, okay, that's 1996. Let me ask you, the National Academy of Sciences, have they put out, or are you familiar with the NAS, the National Academy of Sciences, report in 2009 called The Path Forward?
Yes.
What is that?
That was fundamentally, it was a report by the NAS saying that we've effectively got DNA as the gold standard, and how do the other sciences in forensics measure up in terms of use of statistics, validation, and other things. It was their attempt to codify what needs to be done in some of the other sciences, especially to bring all of forensic sciences forward, because we've gained a lot of technology in the last several decades.
The National Academy of Sciences 2009 report. Did they say anything about group hypothesis? Disavow it or make any comment on that?
I don't recall them doing that now.
If they had made a finding in the National Academy of Sciences report disavowing use of group hypothesis, would you still be using it?
Probably
We don't
not.
object, Your Honor. If he says he doesn't know what's in the report, so how could he know? How could he not use it if he doesn't know it?
No, that's even better. This is an even more important question, even without knowing. Even without knowing. If it says in there not to, if you had read not to do it, would you remember it?
I would have remembered it, yes.
And why would you have remembered it?
Because it would be counter to everything we've been doing in the field for decades.
By the way, counters in the field. There's been some discussion about this group hypothesis, and who's Peter Gill?
Peter Gill is a mathematician. He's currently at in Oslo, Norway, at the university there.
Were you here for the testimony that Ms. Roy gave regarding her communications with him?
Yes.
And discussion about whether you should be doing a group hypothesis or break these numbers out?
Yes.
Do you have an opportunity? Are you familiar with articles written by Professor Gill?
Yes, he's written a lot of articles.
Have those articles included his own personal statements and views regarding the use of the group hypothesis?
Yes.
Can you tell the court, please, whether Peter Gill, other than the private communications with Ms. Roy, has ever made a statement that you're aware of that group hypotheses are a bad idea?
No, he hasn't made that statement. In his published literature, for example, a recent editorial, he walks through the fact that it's one of the values of the likelihood ratio is that multiple hypotheses can be tested and used, group hypotheses of varying sizes of the group. And in fact, I think one of the more important statements he makes is that the size of the group for the prosecution does not have to equal the size of the group for the defense.
That's interesting. Go back to my example for a minute about 250 RFUs and 50 RFUs.
Okay?
You concede, don't you, that 250 RFUs means that there's more DNA from A and B in this sample than there is from C and D?
Yes.
I mean, 250, that's higher, right?
That's higher. That's
okay.
Indicative of more DNA. Yeah.
Well, when you're doing your math and a likelihood ratio and you're asking the question, what's the likelihood of finding these individuals, period, does it matter how much DNA? Is the RFU number a factor?
It is not a factor at the point after you've determined that those individuals exist in the mixture, right? You've gone through, you've done your analysis of the electropherogram, you've determined at that locus that this data is all reliable data, and you've set that aside, and now you've gone back and you're asking the question who matches and doesn't match, can you exclude? And you've determined that in fact the DNA peaks at the 4 individuals that are in question are in fact the same as the 4 DNA peaks here. Then you've established those individuals are there. Now the question becomes, how likely is it that you could find them there? And that you've now used all of the RFU data you're going to use.
So when you're asking the question is the likelihood of finding them all together, not how much somebody contributed.
Not how much DNA they contributed to the sample, that's correct. Because now you're asking the question, what alleles are there and what is the population distribution of those alleles within the group?
There's been some testimony about your use of a program called LR Studio. Do you recall that?
Yes.
The software itself is developmentally validated to be what? What is it?
It is developmentally validated to be a tool to assist in the calculation and exploration of mixed samples using likelihood ratios.
It has the capability, does it have the capability to do probabilistic genotyping?
It does. It has a limited capability for probabilistic genotyping, yes.
Did you do any probabilistic genotyping in this case?
I did not.
I believe you've already testified at some length about what that is, correct?
Correct.
All right, let's not rehash that. Let me just ask. Part of this LR Studio program, does it include a calculator?
Yes, effectively what it allows you to do is the program specifically allows you to set parameters associated with probabilistic genotyping that you can set to 0, which means you're now not doing probabilistic genotyping. You've effectively done the human version of probabilistic genotyping first by determining everything's there. If you do the human version of it first and you can then set those parameters to 0.
As always is the case, I need visuals, so I know what I'm doing. Hold on one second. So, we have this big piece of nasty software. LR Mix Studio. By the way, is that something different than LR Mix?
LR Mix Studio adds a graphical user interface that makes the program easier to use. If you want, you can actually type in hand commands.
What's the most attractive feature to LR Mix Studio to you?
It allows me to do a likelihood ratio, which very often is an equation with many factors, and it allows me to do that calculation that I would otherwise do by hand and do it without making arithmetic errors and other errors.
Yeah.
That's the very best feature of that program.
Well, it has all this stuff it lets you do that you said you didn't use it for, right?
That's correct.
How much money did you pay for this very expensive thing that you're using as a calculator?
I didn't pay anything. It is freeware, it is open source and available to the public.
Okay. So this big thing, it has a calculator, right?
Yes.
What else does it have?
It has the ability for you to do sample to reference comparisons. So you can interpret the electropharogram, you can load that data into the software.
You're telling me it can be an analyst?
It can assist an analyst to make sure that you haven't made mistakes in collecting all of your data, right? So it allows you to compare the electropharogram from the evidence sample to the reference standards, and if you've made a typographical error in entering the data, for example, it will show up as something that is unaccounted for. And then you can go back and ask the question, is it unaccounted for because of interpretation or typographical error?
Right. Does it have controls for, we want to talk about this, drop in and drop out?
Yes, there are drop-down menus that allow you to set drop-in and drop-out values if that's the way you're going to use the program.
And is that part of its role in interpreting the data?
No, actually, once you've completed your interpretation, you're getting ready to do an analysis. The question becomes, are you going to account for drop-in and drop-out, or are you going to set that to 0 and let it do a regular likelihood ratio?
Okay. Now, other than a calculator, and a capacity to interpret DNA, and an ability to set drop-in and drop-out for analysis, what else does LR Mix Studio have?
It has the ability to go in, you can use multiple databases. I have
As
mine.
databases.
Yes. I have mine set up so that I can specify which database I want to look at by using a software queue.
All right. I want to make sure we're not missing anything. Calculate the capacity to interpret data, to set drop in and drop out. Population database. What else has it got?
It's got an analytic and analysis section. You hit the button that says analysis. After you determine, you have to, as part of your analysis, what you do is you tell the machine how many contributors for the prosecution, how many contributors for the defense, how many are known, how many are unknown. So you set up the entire hypothesis for the likelihood ratio just as you do it by hand. And whether you use it as probabilistic or as a manual calculator, you have to set the number of contributors and the hypothesis.
So the analysis part of that is the contributing.
Right, the number of contributors and knowns and unknowns.
I hate to be repetitive, I'm not going to read them all again. What else has it got if I haven't covered it all?
That's it that we use. It does have some other analytical capabilities to give you a sense of sensitivity to other parameters, but these are the main parameters of the program.
Now, do you use a calculator?
Yes.
Did you have it interpret data?
I had it check my work in terms of interpreting the data to make sure I hadn't made any type of graphical errors, yes.
Okay. Did you set drop in, drop out?
Yes, I set them to 0.
0.
Yes.
So you didn't use it at all.
Right, but you still
Why
have
did
to
you do
set
that?
it.
Doctor, why didn't you do that? It's got all this stuff. Why did you set this to 0?
Because I had already determined that drop in and drop out did not occur at the loci I was using for calculation. So if it didn't occur, setting it to greater than 0 would in fact ask the program to assess drop in and drop out where none had happened.
This sounds like a good time to take a quick break.
That's fine. That's fine.
Water, time out. All right, we ready?
You can't.
Yeah.
Like,
All
let's
right.
say somebody comes on, you can't go back.
Continue.
Huh? Let's say somebody comes on,
Wrap.
like
Betty,
now,
we were
they can't
talking about
rewatch
LRMC,
whatever
and
happened.
we were going through the
Oh,
check-in.
probably.
And
Yeah,
you
they
said
give them a, I don't know if
that you set the drop in, drop out calculate 0.
Correct.
You didn't let the machine do that at all.
No.
Tell us again why.
Because when I analyze the electropharogram, and I do so completely, one of the things that I determine is what loci I'm going to use for calculation. And that includes the assessment of is there drop in or drop out at these loci. And if there is not, because SWGDAM makes it clear that you are supposed to use loci where there is no drop in and drop out for your calculation. So because I've already determined that drop in and drop out are in fact 0 at those loci, then I set it to 0 to reflect the interpretation I've already done.
All right, now, we're going to come back to this list, so I'm not going to take it off here, but I want to make sure I understand something. You had already explained to us about probabilistic genotyping. Probabilistic genotyping, does that allow you to use the whole range of loci?
Well, yes and no. The situation is far more complicated in one respect, in that you can allow a probabilistic genotyping program to take the place of a DNA analyst, right? It will assess that data, but it will do so based on what it sees in the electropharogram and not necessarily make all the choices it should make. You have to have an analyst who will guide the probabilistic software, if you will, through that analysis. But what probabilistic software does is, in effect, model the data and use it. It will decide, well, drop in or drop out may have occurred here at some percentage that you set. And then it will effectively say, okay, well, I don't see that peak, but 10% of the time I might have seen the peak, therefore I'll put it there. So you have to be careful how you use that software.
So, and oh my God, is this super rudimentary, but stay with me. All right, assuming you had an electropharia, and I picked 9 locusts, all right?
Okay.
And you found peaks. You found human DNA. I'm going to call him suspect A, all right? And you found DNA that you could rely on in these 3 loci,
Okay.
all right? If you feed all of this data into LR Mix Studio and use it as a probabilistic genotyping form of software, are you saying, assuming it's validated and it does what it's supposed to do correctly, that it's going to create what probably would be in all the other spots?
In some instances, yes.
Is that how probabilistic genotyping is supposed to work?
Yes, actually. It's supposed to model what could be there based on drop in and drop out. The important part that goes with this is that when I interpreted this electropharogram to start with, okay, I looked at all the data that was there, including the loci that you don't have labeled as human DNA.
Okay.
I've already done a scientific assessment of what is at those locations and whether or not it could exclude the individual that when I do the reference, right? When I do that reference, after everything's been said and done, and I go to the reference sample, if the reference is excluded, we never go here again. If he's in, I will have already determined that he's not excluded at the other locations. So I've assessed all that other information before I even fire up the program.
Okay, but and this, the example we're talking about right now, is if probabilistic genotyping is done, right?
Yes.
All right. Now, in describing as you just did, if you ran it through and you did probabilistic genotyping, is the advantage to that in this scenario that you can multiply all of these to come out with some big number at the end?
It's certainly one of the advantages because it's going to add in a lot of other loci that I would not have used in the calculation. And more importantly, if you don't pre-assess the information like this, right? The general feeling is that you can let this program take the place of the DNA analyst, right?
Okay.
So a DNA analyst would not have to do the pre-assessment that I did. And because I've done a pre-assessment, because I know what this data looks like, I have a mental picture, right? This information gives you a certain pace to the data. It tells you a lot about how this information is going to shake out in the end. And if you don't know that, if you haven't done that, and the probabilistic genotyping run gives you information that doesn't make sense, you wouldn't know it.
If you are using LR Mix as a calculator, and you're only feeding in the data of the 3 in the example of DNA there,
Right.
right? Can you use that loci?
No.
How about this one?
Nope.
How about this one?
Nope.
Where the DNA is?
Yes.
Okay, we're okay there.
We are.
How about here?
No.
You use it here?
You can use it there.
How about this one?
No.
So, where if you use probabilistic genotyping, you're multiplying 9 different loci. If you only use it as a calculator, you're only multiplying 3. Correct? Let's go back to the old magic buttons on LR Mix Studio. You use the calculator, right?
Correct.
You interpreted using, now, you interpreted the data, but you said you had to double check the data. All right? What does that mean?
Well, I've interpreted the data. I've created a data table for the evidence sample, right?
Okay?
I create that data table, and then I do that, and I enter it into a spreadsheet.
Okay.
All right, and that's the upload data into the program. So what I let the computer do is check that the numbers that I enter in are consistent for all of the samples, so that if I've made a typographical error, I find it, and I don't run the program using incorrect data.
Let me clarify then, when we're talking about interpret. You mean you use the machine? Are you saying you use the machine to help it check to make sure you didn't type the wrong number?
Correct.
Do you use it for anything else for interpretation?
No.
Set drop in, drop out at 0.
Correct.
Because you're only using these 3, right?
Correct.
Okay. Have your database in there?
Yes.
Okay? And then you set your number of contributors for your likelihood ratio, and you get your number.
Correct.
All right. Some questions about the calculator.
All right.
All right? Is it a magic calculator? Does it have any kind of special ability other than a calculator does?
No. It effectively sets up all of the equations and does the calculation.
Okay. We all have smartphones, or I'm hoping most of us have smartphones. I have a calculator on my smartphone. All right? I don't know how to do a snapshot of this, but I guess I'll just show the lawyers before I show the court. That's how rudimentary my calculator is. Okay? LG. The only reason I do it is because I don't want to show it to them and not show it to you. This is my calculator. Okay? Now, you have a calculator on your cell phone?
I do.
Will you take out your cell phone for me? A little more high tech?
A little bit.
This is just your cell phone, right?
That's just my cell phone.
Judge? Slight difference in what it can do, but still, just a calculator.
Need a PhD in math to use that one.
Okay. On your calculator on your phone, could you actually do the likelihood ratios you did on the LR Mix Studio?
Yes. I mean, this is my calculator, so when I do them by hand, I use this calculator.
Why didn't you, in this case, use your calculator on your phone?
Because that means I'm writing out the entire set of equations, numerator and denominator. I've got all of my various factors for the various possible genotypes, and I'm calculating them out each by hand as I go through, and tabulating and writing, and I have a high probability of making a mathematical error. What LR Mix Studio does for me is all of that and does it without making math errors.
Likelihood ratios are expressed in a fraction?
Correct.
That's a fraction, right?
Yes.
What's the thing at the top called?
The numerator.
What's the thing at the bottom called?
The denominator.
Can you give us an idea of how big, for example, in one of the likelihood ratios, the numerator, do you have any idea how many numbers or mathematical equations are involved in just the numerator on a complex mixture likelihood ratio?
That is the one place where it's likely to be simple. If your hypothesis for the numerator is that all the people that you've identified as possible references are included in the mixture, then that would be 1, right? Everything's explained. So we would say our hypothesis is all the data is explained, therefore the probability is 1. So the numerator could be 1. It could be several hundred factors if it's 1 individual and 3 unknowns, or 2 knowns and 2 unknowns. Depends entirely on the setup of the likelihood ratio.
And what about the denominator? Can you give us an idea as to the size of the denominator?
The denominator, depending on the number of contributors to the mixture, can be hundreds of factors. It can take up the better part of a page just to write out the equation.
There's been some discussion about your use of the calculator and the specific portions of the LR Mixed Studio that you use. So let me ask you about that. There's a report in evidence from Mr. Peter Gill. Did you see that?
Yes,
You've seen that prior to this hearing, haven't you?
I have.
Do we have that? What exhibit is that, do you know? Peter Gill's report from the defense?
I don't know what number it is, it's in there. It's probably 23 or 24.
Okay, can I have 1 second? These are the defense's exhibit? Should be, it's here in order?
Yeah, they're in
Oh, so they're... Here we go. Thank you. I'm going to be referring to Defense Exhibit number 20. Okay? Recognize this document?
Yes.
Would you please turn to the page that has Dr. Gill's instructions that using the calculator on LR Mixed Studio to do likelihood ratios without anything else is improper?
Which section are you asking me?
That's what I'm asking you. I'm asking you to take a second, thumb through that, and tell me where, anywhere in there, Dr. Gill writes in his report that you cannot use the calculator in LR Mixed Studio the way you did it.
He does not in this document. His statement is it's not the way it was intended, but he wrote it as a probabilistic system because that's what he was working on. But he gave you the option, he just makes that statement.
Excuse me. You mean he did it that way because that's what he was told he did?
Yes.
Okay. You made a reference to that report in Dr. Gill talking about whether or not the instrument was validated for a particular purpose, correct?
Yes.
All right. Do you have a PC at home?
Yes, I do.
Connected to the internet?
Yes.
Does it have a function to operate as a phone?
I do have it set up to do voice over IP. I use it as a phone.
It's a big phone.
Yes. Much bigger than my pocket phone.
And a more expensive phone.
Yes.
But when you use it as a phone, does it do anything other than be a phone?
No, it doesn't.
On likelihood ratios, were you here for Ms. Roy's testimony about data from the electropherogram and describing it as pluses and minuses?
Yes.
I want to ask you about that, about pluses and minuses. What is a We good?
Yeah.
What is a minus?
What Ms. Roy was alluding to was that in probabilistic software calculation, when you have all, like that example we showed where we use 3 of the loci but not others, she would like you to believe that it's possible that at some of those loci the likelihood ratio would be less than 1 and therefore decrease the overall number.
But here's where I just want to make sure I understand. In the example that we just did, you analyzed the data at 3 different loci, correct?
Correct.
Didn't you consider the possibility that at those 3 loci there might be some evidence of exclusion?
I absolutely did. In fact, I considered that possibility even at the loci that we didn't use for calculation. So I have already done the scientific version of that calculation by looking for loci where there could be an exclusion. And if I don't have an exclusion at that locus, that means that even though I'm not using it for calculation, there's data there that is consistent with the reference samples. And if that's true, when probabilistic genotype is used, it will be a plus, not a minus.
If the program is properly validated and it works, you won't have a minus because you would have already found it.
You would have already found it. And that's provided that you, as a qualified and trained analyst with sufficient experience, have done that interpretation. If you have sort of limited training and very limited experience, then in fact you're going to rely on the computer to do all of that for you, and you won't know if you've gotten data that makes sense or not, because you in fact have not done that interpretation.
These probabilistic genotyping softwares, whether it's LR Mix Studio or there's also been some testimony about SGR Mix.
Right.
When you're talking about the use of the software for probabilistic purposes, so that you can multiply these larger number of loci, I would imagine it's pretty important that you validate those machines and make sure they work properly.
Correct.
Are you aware of instances regarding the use of the SGR mix where they were not validated properly?
Yes, I mean the program itself works, but it requires, in the case of STR Mix, for example, it requires that you tune the software, if you will, to the laboratory data. That is, the software has to learn what the baselines on your particular machines are. If there are 3500s, for example, the baselines will be higher because the sensitivity range on a 3500 is much larger than a 310. So what you have to do is tune the software to the laboratory data. If you haven't done that, you can borrow parameters, if you will, but it won't necessarily be the right ones, and it would not necessarily be a valid use of the software.
So let me back up for a second. You said something about the difference between the 3500. That's a different type of analyzer, right?
Correct.
Now, when you're talking about being more sensitive, are you saying that the use of the newer software would give you potentially higher RFU peaks?
Yes.
So when we saw the PowerPoint presentation, and we saw these references to 2000 RFU, are you going to see many RFU peaks in the 2000 level on a 310 analyzer?
Not typically, no. And to be clear, that discussion of expected RFU values and what people like to see, that's a nice theoretical exercise. In practicality, we get the RFU values associated with the amount of DNA in the sample, and that is what you have to work with, not some particular sweet spot that you would like to see. That's largely irrelevant. That's like saying the sweet spot for my bank account might be $1 million, but I never see that.
Regarding the issue of exclusion, For all the discussion, all the data on all of the electrotherapies in this case, all of the evidence of electrotherapy, did you consider all data in terms of making an exclusionary decision?
Yes.
Why?
Because that's effectively job one. When you look at a sample and you finally finished your evaluation of the evidence, the next thing you have to do, if you're going to set up a likelihood ratio, and if you're going to set the likelihood ratio up even for probabilistic genotyping, you have to compare the reference sample to the evidence sample. And the point of doing that comparison, the first thing you want to be able to do is exclude somebody if they're going to be excluded. And that's why I said earlier that in fact you use all of the data, even data that might be below the recognized analytical threshold. Because if there's data there that you can deem reliable above the noise call that would exclude somebody, then that's the first thing you want to do. You want to eliminate somebody from that sample.
Before you begin any calculations?
Before you begin any calculations at all.
When you were at Bodie, when you were their chief scientific officer, did you do any work with the Innocence Project?
Yes.
Ever been involved in efforts to clear individuals who have been convicted?
Yes, I have.
Let me just go over this last portion and I think I'm going to down. The method that you use to determine what loci to use for calculation on each of the pieces of evidence in this case, how long have you used that method?
For 30 years.
How many times have you testified in the court of law regarding the method that you employed in this case to determine the loci to use for calculation?
Hundreds. It's what I've done for 30 years, and it's the way I've testified about this for 30 years.
The method you used to identify alleles at specific rows, including peak height, shape, location, all the things you talked about. How long have you used the method that you used in this case to determine those alleles?
Since we first began working with STRs in the early 1990s, well over 20 years ago.
How many times approximately have you testified in a court of law about the use of that method?
Hundreds.
With respect to the formulas used to calculate the likelihood ratios in each of the instances in which you did that in this case, how long have you used those formulas?
In forensic analysis for over 30 years, and longer than that in my graduate and research work.
How many times have you testified in court regarding that method?
Hundreds.
With respect to LR or likelihood ratio calculations, have you used a calculator in your past computations?
Yes, I have.
Did the LR Mix Studio perform any differently in its calculating function than the calculators you used in the past?
No, it did not.
Just going to have one more?
Sure.
One last question. Regarding the use of the calculator, the LR Mix calculator, how do you know the calculator worked?
What I did was I did a hand calculation of a number of likelihood ratios from real test results, set up the hypothesis, did the calculation by hand using my hand calculator, and compared the data to the result I got from LR Mix.
I don't have any further questions at this time.
Probably a good time to break for lunch.
I'm gonna ask her to come back at 2 only because she's still traveling. She's not supposed to be back till after 1 to my office. I don't want to get enough time. If you start at
the hours this morning about various things involved in these therapies. Talking about interference, artifacts, noise, analytical threshold, things like that.
Right.
And he drew some rough diagrams
Rough is being nice.
and asking you to explain those principles of those things that you testified about. I would like to go with you through an actual fairground that's in evidence in this case that will possibly be introduced into evidence at trial, and I would ask you to walk through with you the various principles that you talked about so we can see them in a real life demonstration. Is that what you agree with?
Okay.
For the record, I have a blow-up on the easel of Fairground that was prepared by Mr. Keel, and it's at the top titled AV Applied Biosystems, and it's got a number on it, 0953.
Not 35. It says 0953 is 35.
Oh, I'm sorry. Dyslexia. 09354 BCSO ID E is in Edward 7005 H is in Henry E is in Edward. The word run R-U-N. And it looks like what would be a date of January 8, 2007 at 50 RFU. You've seen this exhibit before, haven't you?
Yes.
And I have a copy, I gave you the copy that's actually in evidence, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Refer to whichever one you want, the blow up or the one that's in evidence. I want to go through. Now, on this fairground, is there evidence of noise or artifacts?
Yes.
Okay, let me ask you, start with the very first D8. Under D8, are there evidence of artifacts or noise?
Well, prior to D8 of the
Prior.
fact.
Okay, go ahead.
All right. It might help if I could stand up and point. That might be easier for you. All right. So this is what's called a die block.
I apologize, just where I am, I'm going to have to move too. I don't want to block anybody else, but in order to be able to see what we're doing here.
Okay. So in this situation, we've got some die front here. This is some leftover
We have die what?
die front. Okay. And then as you go across the electropharogram here, you can see that you've got nice clean baseline for the most part. You have some little peaks here that are probably, some of this is probably noise. It might be human DNA because you've got such a clean baseline here, but there's nothing here you can interpret.
Okay.
Excuse me, can we just say that you're at D7 now?
I'm in a circle, so we'll all know.
But I'm saying, for the record, that's a D7.
Correct, but I want to take you back to D8 first.
Okay. We have two peaks here labeled 12 and 14. But remember what I said initially too is I'm going to look at all of this before I make any interpretation.
Yes,
So I'm going to get a lot of this data in before I work on
Right.
that. Okay, so just making that clear.
Okay, under D8, is there anything that you think would represent either noise, artifacts, or anything like that? Anything under D8?
There is some noise here. You've got some artifacts. So you have this little, for want of a better term, bump right here. You see how that's sort of a broad banded bump as opposed to something sharp like one of these peaks. So that's an artifact or something that was in
So let me
running
circle
through
that.
the
I'm gonna circle that
capital.
in red, okay?
Okay.
Okay.
And again, you have some artifact down here between the 12, or prior to the 12 and after the 14, in this region here.
And what is that peak or bump in between 12
These-
and 14?
Between 12 and 14, that could be a human allele,
Okay.
right? That could be human DNA. It is below 50 RFUs, and I would look at this if I were, when I'm going to make a note of this, right? I'm going to put 12 and 14 down when I interpret this. I'm going to put a note that says something along the lines of bump at 13, right? Because this is the 13 position,
Okay.
right? 12, 13, 14. This is the 13 position. I don't know if this is real, if it's not real, but it's there, and I'm going to make a note of it.
I'm going to circle what you've been referring to as the 13th position of
All right.
reference. Okay?
All right?
And that's in between 12 and 14, correct?
Correct.
Is that bump between 12 and 14, does it meet the analytical threshold?
No.
How about 12 and 14 under D8? Do they meet the analytical threshold?
Yes.
Let's move over to D2, which is right next to D8.
D21, this is
I'm sorry,
D21 S11.
D21, I'm sorry.
I apologize, can we be clear for record purposes regarding this particular electropherogram? Are these markers indicated that this is Mr. McElfresh's review of the
No.
electropherogram or Mr. Keating's?
I already said Mr. Keels.
My apologies, I missed that, go ahead.
Okay, under D21, I'm sorry. Ms. Anglin. Anything of significance under D21?
No. Of interest to me, if we have these 3 peaks right here,
Right.
well, 2 that are well below analytical, probably down in the 25 or 30 RFU bracket. This might be close to analytical, but it clearly didn't make analytical because it's not labeled. But there, you see this spatial orientation here. You've got 3 peaks, fairly evenly spaced,
Right.
in what are positions that they could be human alleles.
Okay.
Right? But they're not labeled. They're not anything I would rely upon for statistics. But if it came down to being able to exclude somebody using this, I would probably look at these again and get a determination on the actual allele size.
Okay.
All right?
Now let's go under D7S.
There's nothing under D7S. There's some noise in the baseline, but that's of
So
no
those little
importance.
bumps under D7S are you considered
Yeah.
noise?
Yes. Well, look at the morphology of the peaks. Very different morphology compared to these. Not spaced in the way I would expect alleles to be spaced. And you have some of this material here falling between D7. There's nothing to talk about at D7.
Okay, moving over to C is in Charles, S is in Sam, F is in Frank, 1P0. Anything of significance under that?
Nothing.
Can you say that again?
Which part?
D, the,
C is in Charles, S is in Sam, F is in Frank, the numeral 1, P is in Paul, O is in Oscar.
thank you.
Let's go down to the second row. It would be D3S.
Right. D3S 1358 is the 1358 is the last one.
Now, let me ask you, there appears to be three bumps there, whatever you want to call them, peaks, right?
Well, there's 2 peaks, but you see how you got a nice morphology to these 2 peaks?
Right.
But look at the morphology of this one. You see this? It's got an odd shape to one end of the peak. This is probably an artifact. It could be some dye left over, but it isn't anything that I'm going to use for interpretation. It doesn't. It's well below analytical.
Well, that's going to be my next question. Under D3S, there's a small peak just to the left on the diagram or on the paragram of the two ones that you said are of that, correct?
Correct.
I'm circling that one, and the one you say is of no value in red, okay?
Correct.
Now, what can you tell me about the other two peaks under D3S?
Well, this is what I was talking about earlier, where you have a situation where one peak is just above analytical, and you would call that the 17 peak right here, right? That's been called. That's just above analytical. And you can tell there's a slight imbalance to these peaks, and this clearly fell below analytical. Mr. Keel didn't label.
Okay, the one that's to the left on the paragram of the 17 under D3S that's not labeled, that may be below the analytical threshold. What number would that be if it was the analytical expression? What can you tell?
It's probably a 15, all right? That's in the place for a 15. But the point here is, you're saying this one is perfectly reliable because it's barely above 50. You're saying this one's unreliable below 50.
Okay.
All right, that's what you're saying. Now, the point here is twofold. One, you're going to look at this, and I'm going to say, okay, this is a 17, but if these two go together, they might be exclusionary for somebody. So I would consider this to exclude somebody. All right? I would consider this. All right? So if we got a 15, and think about this, the other important thing to think about right now is it doesn't matter what any reference sample is. I don't care what the reference sample is, but it doesn't matter what it isn't going to change the position or the shape or the reality of that peak. Okay? So one of the things people worry about is that you might somehow overinterpret because you know what a reference sample is. This is a classic example of I don't care what the reference samples are. It isn't going to change these peaks at all. All right? So, but it is going to, what this may tell me is whoever owns these peaks could be excluded, right? I would use this to exclude somebody. I would use this to say, is it consistent with what I think an inclusion might be based on the real data? And I would not use it for statistics. Okay, so that way I'm not over-representing the data by using something that isn't all there.
But you are going to use the 17, aren't you?
No, I'm not going to use the 7. This doesn't get used for statistics at all. Ruled out.
Okay. Backing off from statistics, for identifying a major or minor contributor, are you going to use the 17?
All I'm going to be able to use this for is to determine if this could exclude somebody. That's the only reliable piece I'm willing to do. However, I'm willing, because I can use it for that, right? Doesn't mean that I can use it for statistics, right? Now, let's also get a grip here. We can look at these two peaks, and we can see that these two peaks are taller than anything else, right? The 12 and the 14, taller than everything.
Right.
These two peaks, no matter what any of this stuff is, these two are taller than everything else.
Taller than everything else under D3.
And under D3.
Yes.
Move to TH01.
Correct. Okay.
Single peak.
Single peak 7.
Possible, that would probably be 9 or 9.3, probably 9, 10, could be 10, 11. I can't tell without doing a measurement because they're not labeled. So I would get out.
So just so I can paint a word picture to go with what you're demonstrating, you're now under TH01.
Correct.
And there's a peak numbered 7.
Correct.
And just to the right of that on the spherogram, there's a couple of small peaks.
Yes, correct.
And this is what you've been
And
describing.
yeah, and they're way down here in the 20 to 30 RFU value, right?
Okay.
So this could be noise, they could be peaks. It's not clear what they are, and Mr. Keel clearly and properly didn't label them as human alleles.
I'm going to circle those. All right.
Okay.
Let's move over.
Well,
Is
we're
there
not
anything
done.
else you want to say?
We're not done.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so notice that over here at 17, in D3S1358, we have two peaks. They're running, we'll call them 50 RFUs,
Okay.
all right? Over here we got a 7, well above that, probably in the 120 RFU value, right here.
Mhm.
That's approximately twice this value right here, and we're in the same dye channel,
Right.
okay? And notice that the dye channels have different values along the x-axis on the graph, all right? So this reasonably is probably a homozygote, all right?
Okay, explain it again for the
That
record.
means that both alleles in the sample are the same size.
Okay.
So I can look at this and go, that's probably a 7-7.
7-7.
Twice what the value of the 17 is, and I'm not, again, it's the tallest thing here, right? Everything else, nothing to see here moving along.
So you would call under THO01 the peak labeled 7. You would call that a 7-7.
Yes, it's reasonable to conclude that that's consistent with a 7-7.
All right.
All right? So now, all right, we have some artifact, we have a pretty flat baseline. We're at D13S317.
Right.
then you move down again to D16S 539 and D2S 1338. Those are the next three loci in this
Wait a
diagram.
minute, D2S and slow down.
I'm sorry, D2S 1338, 1338.
Now, under those three locals, is there anything of significance there?
No, there's nothing here that you can interpret really. These might be human peaks,
You're
but
referring to peaks under
D16S 539, but again, they're now down in the 20 RFU value and below, so they don't offer anything that you can interpret.
Okay.
All right.
Let's go down to the third row, which is D19S433.
Right.
What can you tell us about?
Again, we have a peak at 13 that is up at 360 RFUs, right?
And that peak is looks like on the overall fairground, that's the tallest. Looks like the tallest peak in the entire fairground.
Well, again, it is, as a matter of fact. Look at your X scale here.
Right.
Goes from 0 to about 400, where in the other die lanes it goes from 0 to 180, and in the last die lane 0 to 300. But the point here is we have one really tall peak.
So, and that's a what number?
That's a 1313.
So what is the question? What is the significance of that? The height of that peak?
Again, it is over twice as tall as the other peaks that we see in that. And we have a 12, we have an unlabeled peak at 14, and we have a peak at 15, right? And the 15 is probably barely over analytical. Yeah, barely. And the 12 is twice analytical. This is indicative of some low level of a second individual, probably.
Okay, that's going to be my next
Right.
question. Does the data that you find under D19S433, is that suggestive of of more than one person?
Yes, this is indicative of a mixture right here. All right, and when you look at this in total before you even start the process we're going through now, I will have noted the fact that at D8 SL1179, even at D3 where we have some uninterpretable evidence, THO1 with some additional, that we've probably got something of a very low level mixture going on in the background. We clearly have a major, we have some low level stuff going on in the background. Whether or not it can be interpreted yet, we still haven't figured that out.
Okay, so let's stick under D19.
Okay?
So you've got three peaks, correct?
Yes.
The 12, the 13, and the 15.
Right, and for exclusion purposes, we will probably consider this 14.
14.
Yes.
It's the 14 is not above the analytical threshold.
It is not.
For purposes of inclusion.
For inclusion or statistics, we would not use it.
Okay. But you would use it to exclude some.
Yes.
And you believe that would be in the range of 14?
Yes.
Okay. And again, the significance of the 13 peak under D19S?
This appears to be a homozygote. This is an individual with two alleles that are the same.
Okay. All right.
All right?
Let's move over to V as in Victor, W, A as in Anthony.
Okay.
What can you tell? What is that? What does the data there tell you?
Okay. We have a very small peak at 15 here.
Okay.
Right. Again, well below analytical and probably well within
Okay, I'm going to circle that. That 15 that you indicated is not labeled at 15.
No, it is not.
I'm circling it.
Sorry, that's my knowledge of where these alleles go
Okay.
and interpreting.
Okay.
We have a peak labeled at 16,
Okay.
and probably twice analytical at 100. We have a peak labeled at 17, and we have a smaller peak labeled at 19. Okay, and notice here we have some elevation in some of the baseline noise going on here.
You're indicating on the barogram to the right of 19.
Right, to the right of 19 and actually sort of starting between 17 and 19.
Okay.
And so we have these three peaks, 16, 17, 19, and then for the rest of the dye channel on this panel of the electropharogram, we don't have anything going on. There's no data there.
So let me get into the record. When you say there's no data, you're talking about TPOX, T-P-O-X, correct?
Correct.
And you're talking about D18S51. The data under those two on the fairgram you consider there's nothing there.
Correct.
Nothing of significance.
Correct.
Okay. Let's go down to the bottom row.
This is amylogenin. This sort of determines male, female.
So we know it's a male.
We know it's a male.
Okay.
And we have some imbalance here. This is the point where you would expect in a single sample that's male only that these would be pretty well balanced. But we have some imbalance. We clearly, which indicates
Just so we're talking about the imbalance, the
X peak is higher than the high, higher than the Y. There we go.
Okay.
Sorry. Anyway, the point here is this is where you go back and you remember that this is a weapon, right? It's a
Correct.
metal surface that
Okay.
DNA came off of. We know because metal ions can interfere with PCR, they can interfere with a number of the biological processes that we're likely to get imbalance in the sample, all right? Or if it's a metal surface, you kind of expect it, all right? Now,
And just so the record, what you're saying, it's a metal surface. The swab is identified as coming off of a .40 caliber Springfield Arms firearm that was found in the motel. Okay.
correct. Okay, so, and as I said, I'm expecting to see some imbalance because of what the swab came from. I've got a low-level sample. Again, that may help contribute to the imbalance. But we see it here. We're not surprised. This is a male. All right, let's move on. At D5S818,
Right.
okay, we've got some artifact going on here in the channel to the left of the 12 allele.
Circle that.
Again, we have a 12 allele.
That's what I've circled in red. You don't consider the.
Yeah, that's not human DNA, that's
human
artifact.
DNA. Okay.
All right. We have a 12 allele that's been labeled by Mr. Keel, and a 13 allele. And again, the 13 is much higher. All right, you see the
Much higher
13,
than 12.
it's higher than the 12, and
But both are above the 50 RFU.
that's correct. And this would be, this looks approximately twice the 12, so consistent with a homozygote. All right, I'm looking at this going 13-13 when I look at this.
Okay, so under
D5S
D5S,
818.
the 13, you're considering to be a person who would have a 13-13?
Yes, most likely a 13-13.
Okay.
All right, and then we move down here. The last locus to consider is FGA,
Okay.
and you can see there's a spike labeled here, and
Okay.
that's an artifact. See how that looks so much different than the peaks we've talked about that are human DNA. All right?
Yeah, because of the base?
Yeah. Well, just it's a single spike sticking up out of the baseline. It doesn't look like any of these peaks. This is an artifact.
Okay, so
All right.
on the exhibit, where it says spike under FGA, you consider that to be an artifact, right?
Yes.
Now, what?
That's it. We're done. There's no other information, no human DNA information to be gleaned from this.
So based on what you've seen from examining this paragraph, what conclusions can you draw in terms of potentially identifying anyone
Okay.
associated with
We have a major profile,
it?
right?
And tell me how you're concluding that, and which locus that you're referring to.
Okay, well, we have everywhere, you see that we have a major here, right? These two are much,
Can you just, what you're,
at D8, S1179, the 12 and 14 peaks are significantly higher than anything else there. They're the only two things labeled, all right? We don't have any other data in that dye channel. Here, we have two peaks approximately, I'm sorry, D3, S1358. Again, two peaks higher than everything else. One just below analytical, one above. We have at TH01, we have this 7.7 peak. It's the only data we have, right? That qualifies as major, okay? And then as you look through
Now,
these...
does that qualify as a 7.7 or I don't know?
I don't, it's a 7.7, that's my
That's what you're...
my interpretation
Okay.
is, based on what we've learned, but by looking at the entire electropherogram, but we don't have anything else even labeled in this dye channel.
Okay.
All right. So we move down to D19. Again, you have one peak well above all the others, right?
That's a 13.
Right. Major. In VWA,
And that major that you identified under D19, you consider that to be a 13-13?
yes.
Okay.
Right? In VWA, we have an interesting situation here. We have 16, 17, and 19, and these are all approximately even, right?
Okay.
We have one slightly less, we have two slightly even, we have an artifact there. This may or may not be part of the major, but as I look at this right now, I'm not going to include this in a calculation.
Okay, so...
Right, because this is not clear major on anything, right?
Just
Compared to what we have on the other
So just so I'm clear, for setting a verbal record here, under
VWA.
VWA, the data that you see reflected there on the paragram, you're not going to use it to do what?
Do a statistical analysis.
Are you going to use it to...
I'm gonna look at this and see if it excludes anybody,
Okay.
right? And so if it does, then this is an exclusion and it trumps all the other calculations anyway. But if it doesn't, I'm still not going to use it as statistical analysis because I don't have what I think is an honest, clear major here.
Okay.
All right?
All right.
So one last time we go down here to D5S818. We have a 13, roughly twice the 12, much higher. We're going to look at this. We're going to see if the 1313 is inclusive or exclusive for an individual, and then determine what we're going to do from there. Right? We're going to look. We've done everything we can do, and again, let me stress, there is absolutely nothing that I can do when I look at a reference sample that will change any of this data.
Okay, so you've concluded all of this without having ever looked at anybody, any individual person's DNA sample, correct?
That's correct. We haven't looked at anybody's DNA sample in doing any of this.
And just so I'm clear on this last one, you would consider the 13 under D5S to be a 1313?
That is a consistent genetically scientific result.
Okay. Now, when you do your calculations, what data on here would you do in this group calculations that you do? Which data on this paragraph would you use in attempting to establish that?
First of all, this is a major profile.
Are you talking about a group calculation, or are you talking about a random match probability?
Is random match probably?
Right, I was about to clear that up for you. Right, this is a major profile, so we would do a random match probability on the source of this particular profile.
Okay.
Right, so we're going to look at what all this turns out to mean. So the next thing we have to do, however, is can we eliminate somebody? Are we eliminating anybody? Are we including them? So the next thing you would do then is go through and say, well, if I'm going to do a calculation, what's my interpretation? Does it match anybody? If it doesn't match anybody, there's no calculation to do.
Right.
All right? So you would then do your comparison.
All right.
And as it turns out, I ended up agreeing with Mr. Keel that these are in fact consistent with Mr. Forbes.
Okay.
All right? Now, honestly, when I look at this, I don't look at the reference samples. We haven't done that yet.
Okay.
It doesn't matter what somebody tells me at this point.
Okay.
The only thing that makes any sense is the genetic data on this electropherogram.
Okay.
That's what rules the day. All right?
All right.
But when we do that, we know, for example, we're not going to use D3S1358 because even if this data is inclusive of Mr. Forbes, it doesn't all rise above the analytical threshold. We're not going to use it.
Okay.
All right? This data, even if it's
Talking about
under VWA,
right.
this data, even if it's inclusive of Mr. Forbes, right, we're not going to use it because we don't have a clear major here.
Okay.
All right? So we're going to go back and only use the loci with a clear major, and the reason for that is we don't over-represent, or I believe as Ms. Roy said, overweight the data.
Okay.
All right?
So which then put into the record, or speak into the record then, which you would use?
So we would, when we've done our comparison, all right, and now I've done my comparison, I agree with Mr. Keel, these are the, where he's put these dots, where he says it's Mr. Forbes, I now agree with him, all right?
Well, you say these dots. On this paragraph, and unfortunately I don't have, mine's not in color, I think his original was.
Yeah, there's black dots over some of the peaks at the various loci.
On this
Right.
example.
So we're going to go through and we're going to use D8S1179. We're going to use TH01. We're going to use D19S433. And we're going to use D5S818 for our calculation.
So that's how many locals?
We have 1, 2, 3, 4.
Okay.
All right?
And then what would you do then after that?
Did I count it right? We got 1, 2, 3. Yeah, okay, 4, 5, maybe 5.
No, 4. You said 4. You just went through it. D8, O1, D19, D5.
Right. Okay. So we're going to do that, and where's my D3? There it is. Okay. So the D3, when I'm looking at it here, all right, I pointed out that this is below, this is above, and is this?
So on your chart, you are.
Yeah, this is included incorrectly, I think. Let me look.
Well, can you just tell us what's included where incorrectly on your...
Well, I'm looking.
That's what he's
hold on, just a minute.
Hang on, just for the record.
And this is just a moment.
Excuse me, can I make a legal objection for a moment, please?
Okay, go ahead. Get him to it.
When he says this is included incorrectly, you're looking at your, whatever your exhibit
And I'm
is.
just about to get him to
Can
identify.
Can I just...
Excuse me, also, this is not a legal objection. You're asking to get clarification, maybe?
No, but I just want to know the number of this exhibit, because you have it. It's your exhibit.
It's-
Delancey's one.
Delancey's one,
Okay.
consisting of 2 pages. He's
Okay.
referring to the
Okay,
first
and-
page,
well,
and I'm
hang
getting him ready to clarify
Okay, hang
what
on.
he just said.
I just want the record to reflect then, Dr. McElfresh, when you were just telling us...
I'm sorry, who's doing the examination?
I'm just
gonna
wanting the
have to
record
object
to
to
just
let
like...
the man finish
Whoa,
his
wait a
question and
minute,
answer.
wait a minute.
Stop it!
Well, Mr. Williams does this to me all the time. I just want to clarify the record so we have what's happening here.
That's
all
what-
I'm trying to do.
that's what he's trying to do.
No, I want to do something. Just
On
you
your
can do it on
cross,
your
you
side
can
of
do
the
whatever you want.
case.
And stop arguing.
Well, then how about telling
Both of you.
How about telling him not to do that to me then? Clarify the record when I don't need it clarified.
Would you please clarify the record?
Okay. On your chart,
Don't raise your voice to me again.
on Delancey's Exhibit 1, the first page, it looks like on your chart you included 5 locals. Is that correct?
Yeah, I did.
Okay. So you,
And-
and now in looking at it again, you're saying that one, you might have been an error in including that. I want you to identify that on the first page of the chart.
Yes.
Okay.
All right. I typed this in as a 1717 for D3. It would appear that I know what I did next was the 77.
Right.
So I clearly inappropriately included this one.
Okay.
But we
So-
can do that calculation real quick and fix the answer, so that's how.
Yeah, well, that was going to be my next question. So, Mr. Molda, on the chart, D3S1358, where it says 1717, should not be included.
Yeah, I'm
Correct.
well aware of that.
Okay.
All right, so we can go back through this.
Mr. Williams, Dr. McElfresh is doing calculations. Can you tell him to tell us what calculations he's doing?
Hang on,
He's, let him to finish it the last one.
I will tell you. Okay,
Okay,
So-
explain to us what you just did on your telephone calculator that you previously showed the court.
okay. Now, let me make sure that everybody understands. First of all, I would never consider interpreting an electropharogram like this the way we've just done it, in terms of having lots of people standing around with the bright light shining on. Okay? I spend hours looking at these things, all right? So, again, it's also an excellent example of why somebody uses something like LR Mix or another computer program to keep you from making typographical errors, all right? So, what I've done here is for D3S1358, and I'm going to reserve the right to go back and look at this again and make sure that I agree with what I'm now doing contemporaneously.
Okay.
Nonetheless, let's make that argument. I'm not sure I disagree with what I've just been through, and I would ask somebody to peer review this before I go further. But nonetheless, what I've done now is I've gone through, and to show you how easy it is, I mean, I just stood here right in front of you and did it. We used D8, TH01, D19, and D5 S818.
Okay.
All right? And I multiplied those back out, and the answer that I would give based on this interpretation under these conditions at this time,
Right.
that interpretation, it would be 18,273 times more. The probability of drawing this DNA pattern at random in the population would be 1 in 18,273.
Okay, so the figure then, the original figure was 1 in 408,000.
Right. That would be, yeah, that would be the difference between having or not having D3.
So at this point in time,
Wait, having or not having what?
D3 in there.
so so at this point in time, assuming that it's proper to back out D3, then the number would be reduced to what?
1 in 18,000.
Okay.
All right?
Now, you said earlier that there are apparently locusts or alleles that have greater weight than others. Is that correct? You were talking about something?
Sure, it would depend on the frequency of that allele in the population.
Okay. Are there any in this example of the ones that you found were significant for analytical purposes that have greater weight than others?
Well, if you look,
And if so, how do I determine that?
well, you can look on this sheet right here.
Okay.
All right, if you look
Are you
on,
referring to the first page of Delancy's one?
correct.
Okay.
For D8S1179, you have, in the African American population, the 12 allele has a frequency in the population of 14%. It's listed as 0.14147 on the, right? And the allele 2 is 30%,
Okay.
0.30039. So one is approximately in twice the frequency in the population that the other one is.
Okay. So if I take this table you've got here, and I go down column by column, that tells me the percentage in the
Yes,
various populations, whether it be Caucasian, African American, Hispanic.
right.
Okay. So it looks like, though one, that the 7 allele, the 7-7, appears in like 42% of the African American population?
Yes. And as you can see, that allele appears in 42% of the African American population, just 19% of the Caucasian population, and about 28% of the Hispanic population.
Okay.
So when I reported this number, I gave you the most common number.
Right.
Anything else you want to calculate would increase the odds.
Okay, all right. Oh, now, what's the, I'll state that for Mr. Harrison. Thank you.
All right?
Yeah, exactly. You will. That'll be the day.
This is well done.
I need a minute then, Joe. This is, I want to be able to deal with this. I need to know my expert.
Of course. That started a while ago.
I'm gonna switch files.
That's a dirty word for us on that.
Judge, could I just start with him for a little bit and take a break? Would that be better so we can get going?
Sure.
I want to finish him
I
today.
just switched
so I
out
don't-
the meeting minutes. Oh, well.
Ironically, it hurts.
Okay, so Dr. McElfresh, let's stay on this exhibit if we can, please, all right?
All right?
So, I want to go through, first of all, the loci that you just did with respect to your first analysis before you know the standards of Mr. Forbes or Mr. Delancy or Mr. Ingram, correct?
All right?
So when you look at the D8, you see the 12-14. The 14 is twice the height of the 12, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, so just like in, let's say, for example, D19, when you have the 12 is a little less than half the 13, and the 15, you say, the 13 right away I know is a homozygote, right?
Yes, that's consistent with the
So how do you not look at the D8 and say, well, the 12 is less than half the height of the 14, so right away I should think the 14 is a homozygote, correct?
The 14 doesn't exist in isolation. The 12 and the 14 are there. They're the two highest peaks there. I'm on a metal surface. It's possible that we're looking at imbalance. There's not enough information in D3 to give me a definitive answer on the 14. And we're looking at something around...
Wait, you said D3, we're at D8.
I'm sorry, D8. I meant D8, not D3. D8. You're talking about the 12 and the 14 at D8. They don't exist in isolation the way the TH017 does, or that the 13 is so dramatically higher at D19.
Well, that's my initial question. The 13 is dramatically higher than the 12 and the 4 at D19, and the 14 is dramatically higher than the 12 at D8, correct?
Well, they might be dramatically higher to you, but they're not to me.
They're not?
No.
The 13 at D19 is not dramatically higher than the 12?
It is higher, but it is not dramatically higher, and you're
Wait, I
falling...
just want to make sure I understand you. The 13 at D19 is not dramatically higher than the 12?
Okay, the 13 at D19 is dramatically higher than the 12.
Okay, so we've got that. The 13 is dramatically higher, and it's, what, at least over 2 times what the 12 is, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So now when you look
In
at
fact, it's closer to 3 times.
Okay. But when you look at the D8, the 12 is probably still a little less than half of the 14, correct?
But it's not your,
Yes or no? Just yes or no for that, please. Does the 12 look to you to be slightly less than half the 14?
no.
It doesn't. What does it appear to you to be?
I
More than
want to,
half?
I need to answer your question with words, not with yes or no.
No, I'm saying, does it appear to be less than half, greater than half, exactly half? What does it look to you to be?
I'd have to spend more time to give you an exact answer to that question.
Okay, fair enough. But you're saying when you first look at this, you absolutely are sure that the 13 is a homozygote and you don't suspect that the 14 could be a homozygote?
I don't suspect that initially, no.
Okay, but now you've said, because at the D19 we have at least 3, so there's other data there. But again, you've already said, right, isn't that correct? That's why you say I'm suspecting the 13 is a homozygote, because at the 19 you've got other data showing at least a second person?
I'm afraid you went all over the place with that question.
Well, didn't you
You're gonna
just
have to
say that
clarify.
I'm thinking the 13 is a homozygote because we have other alleles at D19, so
Interpretation of this is what I gave earlier, and
No.
I need to make it clear that at this point, we are now in the minutia of interpretation of electropherograms, and I do not do that in situations like this.
Exactly.
Right,
So
I don't
let's move
interpret
on. So let-
electropherograms in
Like
court.
this, on the fly.
No, absolutely not.
Perfect. So now, let's go over to D3, which now you said, when you stood up there, you said, listen, we can't use this data at all, correct? Except for exclusion.
We would use that data for exclusion, that's correct.
Only.
But again, because I don't do this on the fly, and I don't do it standing up in front of people like this other than for demonstration purposes, we have to look at the fact, and I made this clear when I talked about it, that 17 is barely above threshold. The co-allele at 15 is barely below threshold. Those are both valid alleles, right? There's absolutely nothing that establishes the fact that at 50 RFUs you have a perfectly valid allele, and at 49 RFU you have an invalid allele.
All right, let me just stop you there for a minute. You have no idea if that's 49, 48, 47, 40, just let me finish. 46, 45, 44, you have no idea, right?
I know that they're close, and I know that at least one is over 50.
No, I'm saying that what you're thinking could be the 15 allele. You have no idea if it's 46, 49. You keep saying 49 like it's a certainty. You don't know if it's 49, do you?
I don't care if it could be plus or minus 10 of that. It's
So it could be
clearly well
40.
above baseline.
It could be 40, and that would be okay with you.
Probably.
And yet Mr. Raff just went through that analysis saying you have to double the level for noise, which was 20, so 40. At 40, you can't call anything. Didn't he just say that and you agreed with him?
You were talking about something completely different.
Okay, let's move on. At THO1, you have the 7, and you have other noise there, or it could be DNA, correct? You don't know.
You don't know for sure.
Okay, and yet there's that 7 is clearly not twice the height of, or so significant that you would know it's a homozygote without looking at the standard, right?
Of course you would.
When you look at D8 and the 14 is twice the height of the 12, you don't suspect that's a homozygote. But when you look at the 7 on THO1, which is, do you think that 7 on THO1 is twice the height of the 17 at D3?
I'm sorry, you're asking a whole bunch of interpretation questions, and you're mixing and matching all kind of different predicates, and none of that makes any sense.
Okay. Is the 7 at THO1 twice the height of the 17 at D3?
Immaterial.
Okay, well then how in the world do you call it a homozygote without looking at the standard? How would you know if it's not just, you know, a good sample of, with another allele that's hardly reporting, that's dropping out?
What other peak is there that's DNA? There's a
At
7.
THO1, at
There's
THO1.
I'm sorry, could he be allowed to answer the question?
Please.
The peak at the 1 stands by itself, and it's the only peak there.
Wait a minute. On the diagram, didn't Mr. Williams circle one right next to the 7 as
Those
possible? Wait, let me finish my question, sir. Didn't Mr. Williams circle that because you just said that's possible DNA?
I said it's possible DNA or artifact.
No, he only, hang on, I mean, we can read this back. He didn't circle, when you said it's artifact, he said, I'm not going to circle it. I'm only going to circle ones that you say are possible DNA.
That's not true.
Hold it, wait.
Oh, wait, hold on, maybe I'm wrong on that, I'm sorry.
Well, wait,
That's
hold
not
on. Stop with the interaction.
I'll just answer it.
The doctor is well able to clarify himself based upon the question, so let a witness for a change answer a question.
Not a problem. Sorry, I'll ask another question. Are you saying that what he circled next to the 7 is or is not DNA? Can you tell us?
The circled dot may or may not be DNA.
Okay, all right. So then, let's go down to VWA, which you say you didn't use for the computations, correct?
Correct.
But again, looking for this consistency for a major profile, you would show that the 16 and 17, which are labeled, are almost the exact same height, correct?
Yes.
Okay, and the 19 is about half the size of the 16 and 17, right?
I don't know that I agree with that.
Well, how much less do you think the 19 is than the 16 and 17?
Again, I'm not going to sit here and make that interpretation right here.
Well, let me ask you this.
Let me made it
Can you
clear.
finish,
I'll ask
please?
another question.
Can you finish his answer, please?
Okay.
I made it clear that that did not meet my specification for a major profile, but that there was real DNA there, and it may or may not exclude the reference when I do that comparison. But I did not use it for calculation for that very reason.
Understood. But wouldn't you think that if you're looking at that and you're thinking there's a major profile, it would appear the major profile should be the 1617, or might be the 1617?
I think that at that position, we don't know what a major profile is because we have 3 peaks fairly close in height, and it isn't clear that we have a major at that location.
Okay, so when you say fairly close in height, I mean, the record speaks for itself, what says 16, 17, and 19. Okay, so what you did when you had hours and time was not an issue to do these calculations, like you said, in the quiet of whatever you're doing, you do a computation, and at D3, you put a 1717, correct?
Yes.
How in the world did you do that? With hours and hours to look at things and load it in safely? Because you're the guy, when you were on direct with Mr. Raff, did I not hear you say that the reason the genotype software doesn't work well is because in some instances it adds a probability where you, Dr. McElfresh, know there's absolutely dropout and there's no reason to put anything in there?
I'm not sure the context you're asking that question, so I'm not sure I know which answer you're talking about.
Okay, well, I can have her read it back. Would you like us to do that? I'll ask her to do that at a break, so we don't waste the time. So, but you don't think you said that, the way I asked that question, you don't think, when you were talking about genotype software, specifically STR mix, I think, and LR mix, when you were giving the example, you say, I, Dr. McElfresh, analyze all the data, and the example being, if I think there's no dropout, then I zero out in the LR mix. I zero out that loci, right?
Yes.
Okay. And didn't you say that one of the problems with genotyping software, or one of the issues with your issues with genotype software is the genotype software will automatically, if there's a 10% chance there is an allele there, will disregard like your exercise, and it will still put 10% a possibility of an allele appearing, correct?
What genotyping software will do is impute data that may or may not be there. And it requires an experienced analyst to be able to look at the electropherogram and see if what the imputation of data is actually makes sense with regard to the biological evidence.
Right, and my point was, and you're saying you are the experienced analyst, correct?
That is correct.
And you would know better that there really should be nothing there, even though the genotype software is designed to put something there, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So, what you've done here with D3, you've put in a 1717. So not only have you included data that you say in the column you should have recognized is useless, correct? You should have recognized D3 was useless when you looked at this, when you did your computations, yes?
No.
You shouldn't.
No.
Okay? But you also put a 1717, which is not even my client. My client's a 1517 at D3, right?
Your client, according to Mr. Keel in that, since I'm not looking at the reference sample and I don't have that memorized, is in fact a 1517.
Right.
And what makes me...
I'm saying, well, my whole question
I'm
is...
sorry, again, can he finish?
Well, wait, no, because my question, Judge, is you put the wrong number for my client in the computation.
He's trying to answer your question.
No, he's not.
Let him answer, then ask him another.
Well, the first question, so answer this question. If
I
my
apologize,
client,
I'm in the middle of judgment.
Ask
He's
him
in the
on
middle of
read
giving
direct.
an answer.
if my client's a 1517, you put in a wrong number for the first allele for my client, correct?
Yes, it's most likely that I made a typographical error. I should have put a 15 and a 17 there instead of a 1717.
And again, I'm going to have to object to all this reference to he did. The exhibit that's on the board is in fact, according to the testimony in the record, an electropharogram put together by Alan Keel. I don't know as he's doing his analysis, is he answering now, I'm asking the witness,
Well,
is
it's
he
not
answering now what
an
you
objection to
marked?
what Mr.
You are interrupting
I'm objecting.
again.
This is no longer an objection.
So he's objecting and you're objecting to his objection while he's trying to make his objection.
Because he's now asking the witness
He's
something.
not asking him anything.
Okay, I thought he was.
Very specifically, I'm objecting to assuming facts not in evidence every time the reference is to marks put there by the witness to the extent that the exhibit was put together by Mr. Keel. And I need, every time that question is asked, what are we talking about? Are we talking about what Dr. McElfresh did or what Dr. Keel did in
What
the
Dr.
label?
McElfresh did, that's why I said
Thank you.
his exhibit.
Go on.
Right,
As
your
long as that's
exhibit, you put a
clarified.
1717, when first of all you agree D3 you shouldn't be using any data, correct?
In taking more time to think about it, first of all, it's clear the 1717 was incorrect. But it may well be that the 1517 is in fact the major profile at that locus. Right? Because you have a 15 and a 17, they're the only two peaks there, one barely above analytical, one barely below analytical. So it is not unreasonable to consider that 1517 as a locus at that electropharogram, which is why I made it clear that I reserved my judgment in terms of interpretation and calculation in this type of environment.
However, you only created that reservation when you looked at your conclusions and realized, uh-oh, I just said 4 and I really have 5. That's the first time you ever said, you know what, this is not a good way to do this. Isn't that correct?
No.
You didn't start out by saying, listen, I don't want to do this. I don't want to do this on the fly with Mr. Williams. When he asked you, you went through it with him, agreeing, yes. You never said, I shouldn't do this here on the fly, did you?
I think I made it clear as we went through this, and he made it clear to me in his questioning, that he wanted to talk about some of the parts and pieces of an electropharogram. That's fair.
Right, and you were doing it. You didn't caveat first saying, I really shouldn't do this. The only time that caveat came out is when you realized you made a mistake.
The caveat was always there. It always has
Okay.
been. I am not changing my testimony on that.
So let me just ask you this. Were you here when Alan Keel testified?
I was.
And you remember Mr. Schatz showing him a bunch of electropharograms, including RC1, and he said, listen, I shouldn't be doing this because I haven't seen it in a long time. Remember that?
Yes.
And you remember he looked at this one and said something about that being Bernard Forbes, or whatever he said, the record will speak for itself. Remember that?
Yes.
And then he came back on a week later and said, you know, I misspoke. I shouldn't have done that on the fly when he showed it to me. I really should have gone back and looked at it. Because when I went back and looked at it, this is worthless and I never should have called it. You remember him saying that?
I do, but I cannot speak for him.
Do you remember him saying that when you were in here? Do you remember him saying that?
Something to that effect.
So does the same hold true for him? He really shouldn't be held to what he did on the fly when Mr. Satz first showed him. Same, you would accord him the same courtesy you're asking for, correct?
I can stand by the work that I've done with the exception of the 1717, and that's what I will do.
I'm saying, so the same courtesy you're asking for, which is we shouldn't expect you to do this on the fly, we should accord the same courtesy to another expert, correct?
I'm not here changing my testimony.
I'm not asking you that. I'm saying the fact that we're asking you to do it under the lights in the middle of a courtroom, the same should hold true for any experts like yourself, correct?
I think that I've made it clear what I've talked
This
about.
is a yes or no answer. This is just, would he accord the same courtesy to another expert? The man can't answer a question yes or no, no matter what.
Give it a shot at a yes or a no, then you can.
Would you accord the same courtesy to Mr. Keel that you're asking for yourself?
Objection to relevance. Doesn't matter what he
Okay,
says.
well,
Go ahead, if you can answer it, answer it.
Yes, I think every electropharogram should be done properly.
thank you. And now, just for everyone else's edification, let's go through this electropharogram, if you will, and what you've just called, and travel through that with respect to some of the others than Mr. Forbes for a moment, okay? So let's go back to D8, if you will, right?
Okay?
And you said you've got a 1214. You said you have a 1214, and you have a peak at 13 a peak that could be at 13, very well may be a real DNA, correct?
Possibly.
Okay. And it turns out Mr. Ingram is a 1314 at locus D8.
No, he's a 12.
Mr. Ingram?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Let me make my record, will you? Right? Mr. Ingram's a 1314 at D8, correct?
I don't have his reference sample in front of me, and I don't have his genotype.
Okay, well, I'm looking at it. We'll take my word for that. And then at D3, well, D3 you're not using, so we'll leave that out. At D7, noise, no value for everything else, so we'll leave that out. You can't tell at so one what those other peaks are, correct?
No.
Okay. D19, you have a 12, 13, 15 mark, correct?
Yes.
And you said it looks like there's a 14 there, correct?
Correct.
And you said it's a mixture, 12, 13, 14, 15, even though the 14 is not labeled, correct?
Correct.
So at D19, my client, Mr. Forbes, is a 13, 13, that's what you said is the homozygote, correct?
Correct.
And at D19, Mr. Ingram is a 12, 14, so you... no, I'm sorry, Mr. Delancy is a 12, 14, correct? Well, Mr. Delancy is a 12, 14, and Mr. Ingram is a 13, 15. So how in the world can you possibly say if Ingram's not contributing a 13 to that 13 there, or if Delancey's not contributing the 12, 14, how can you determine any of that? You can't, right?
There is insufficient data on this electropharogram to discuss anybody other than Mr. Forbes.
Okay. And then at okay, so that's it. So I mean, it's certainly some of those other loci, some of the alleles you potentially call match up to some of, well, don't match up, but certainly you have alleles that are possessed by some of the other defendants, just like Mr. Forbes.
There's insufficient data on this electropharogram to discuss anyone other than Mr. Forbes.
So what I'd like to do now is go back to your direct examination today with Mr. Rath. And I want to start with his example of, of that A, B, C, D example.
You want me to take that down?
Yeah, if you can, I don't want to, I don't know if this is.
I think his stuff is on the back. Maybe tear it down.
I tore it out down.
Oh,
But I can give you
Where
what
is
it
it?
is.
Where is it?
I have portions of it, but not all of it. I have some of it folded up, but I threw some of it away.
What?
Just for demonstrative purposes.
He didn't introduce it, didn't make it a court exhibit.
Well, I don't know.
I can give you what the examples were. I mean, it's all on the record, A, B, C, and D.
You don't have to give me anything.
While I'm tearing this down, can we make this a court exhibit?
For
Delancy.
Delancy. You want it as an actual exhibit or a demonstrative?
We could demonstrative exhibit, Delancy.
Okay, it'll be a demonstrative exhibit number 1 for Delancy. How many pages?
It's 1 page.
How much paper did you take with you?
Too much.
Sort of towards the end of all of this examination, that really these calculations that you are doing, you've been doing for 30 years, correct?
Correct.
Or more than 30?
In some instances, yes.
Right. Likelihood ratios, random match probabilities, right?
Correct.
And I guess the idea was, that's why you're the most experienced, that's why your experience is so valuable, is because of all of that.
I believe the purpose of the question was to show that these mathematical equations have been used for a very long time.
Oh, right, but, okay, so let's go with that. So they've been used for a very, very long time. But the reality is, and you used some examples of back in 92 and 96, the National Research Council had various guidelines that you operated under, correct?
Yes.
Okay, but in the reality, Dr. McElfresh, I mean, in 92 and 96, all of your calculations, I mean, that was, like back in the 80s, I mean, 30 years ago, we're talking about, there was no internet back then, right? That's like pre-science almost, right? In terms of what you were dealing with what we're doing today, correct?
I don't even begin to understand what you're asking.
Okay, well, let me ask you this. Back in 92, for example, were you using PCR?
I was in my laboratory, yes.
You were.
Yes.
Were forensic labs using PCR? Were they reporting PCR?
There was a PCR test called DQ polymarker that was based on PCR amplification of the HLA complex, and I was in the process of I was in the throes of a research project funded by the federal government, actually developing and synthesizing the primers for the very first STRs.
Okay.
So I was using STRs in terms of research.
Okay, exactly. That was all research. There were no rules promulgated by NCR about PCR back then, correct? You were still using
You mean NRC?
NRC, I'm sorry. That was mostly RFLP they were using back then, right?
That is correct. It was RFLP.
Right. So when you're saying all this 30 years of using these calculations, we weren't even dealing with PCR in 92 as a forensic tool used by analysts in the field. It was in a research stage, correct?
Objection, improper compound question. It is combining the question of the statistical analysis and formulas, which are completely separate and apart from how you actually analyze the physical evidence. The two are unrelated.
Did you say that 3 times fast? Just break it down, that's all.
So the computations and calculations you were doing dealt with RFLP, not PCR, correct?
The computations and calculations have nothing to do with the biological process.
Okay, but I'm saying it was RFLP that you were using back then, correct?
It was RFLP that we were using back then.
Okay, and what we're talking about here, when we talk about combined mixtures, that really, those combined mixtures have only been utilized, significantly utilized in the forensic DNA analysis for what, 10, 12 years?
We had compound mixtures back in the 1980s.
But I'm saying the analysis of them, for example, genotyping software, probabilistic genotyping, has been around for what, 10, 12 years?
Probably 10 years.
Okay. And the probabilistic genotyping was created by experts, people who are recognized experts in the field, correct?
Yes.
Do you consider those people the elite of the experts in the field that are able to create the genotyping software?
I think they're very good programmers.
Do you think they're some of the more renowned experts in the field of forensic DNA analysis?
I think they're experts at DNA analysis, and I think they're very good DNA programmers, or computer programmers.
Okay. And in terms of developing that software, it was developed for the problems that they recognized had been occurring with the analysis of complex mixtures, correct?
It was developed for the analysis of complex mixtures, irregardless of what problems you're speaking of. I don't know what problems in specific you're asking about, but the software was developed to help DNA analysts who are trained interpret forensic DNA mixtures.
Because the interpretation of complex DNA mixtures was becoming more and more difficult the smaller the samples, correct?
Interpreting a forensic DNA mixture is very difficult for inexperienced analysts or analysts with minimal training that they would receive in a state laboratory. That hasn't changed, and that's why that software was developed, to help less experienced analysts be able to interpret a forensic mixture. An experienced DNA analyst is perfectly capable of doing at least what the computer program can do, if not a better job than a computer program will do.
And you're talking about now the DNA analysis of discerning whether to recognize peaks at a certain loci in electrophoregram, things of that nature, correct?
I'm talking about the complete analytical process.
Well, certainly the computations, the calculations, that's one of the reasons the genotype software was created, for the very reason that the calculations have become so burdensome, if you will, or so voluminous, correct?
The calculations are indeed very voluminous, and the software helps with that in every aspect.
And that's why you said you use the LRMix software, because it relieves you of that problem of having to do it all by hand on a calculator.
That is correct.
Okay, so with respect, give me a moment. Okay, so with respect to what we're talking about in terms of probabilistic genotyping and probabilistic genotyping software, when you say the computations and the calculations are difficult, those programs solve that problem for analysts as well as statisticians, correct?
They can, but no probabilistic genotyping was done here.
No, I'm just talking in general about probabilistic genotyping. I'm saying it solves some of the analyst problems, and it solves some of the problems for the statisticians as well.
I think it solves some of the analyst problems. The statistics remain the same either way.
No, the calculation, the fact of having to do all those calculations, and like you said, and having a typographical error, which we just saw you had in one of these yourself in this case, right?
Yes, it helps eliminate those kinds of errors.
So now, okay. So when we're talking about you, Dr. McElfresh, doing computations and calculations, for example, an analysis, when you do random match probability, likelihood ratio, and CPI, those are three binary approaches to providing weighted evidence for interpretation, correct?
You've mixed about 3 questions together.
Okay, so let me
The
start.
answer-
You want me to break it down?
Please.
Okay. Do you agree that likelihood ratio is a binary approach to interpretation?
As done in this case, yes.
And you do you believe random match probability is a binary approach?
Yes.
And CPI is a binary approach?
I don't do CPI.
You don't?
I do
Okay.
not.
So you agree that the random match and the likelihood ratio is a binary approach?
Yes.
Okay. So when you were analyzing, let's try that. Let me just have a moment. Okay, so do you believe you need a stochastic threshold to perform a binary method of analysis?
A stochastic threshold is useful, but it isn't definitive.
You don't think you have to have a stochastic threshold in order to use a binary method?
I said it's useful, it's not definitive.
Not mandatory?
I said it's not definitive. I didn't say it was mandatory. You can have one, that's fine, but it isn't definitive.
I'm asking for you to do calculations in the binary method that you just described. Do you think it's mandatory to have a stochastic threshold?
I'm not sure I understand the basis of your question.
Well, okay, do you understand the question? That you must have a stochastic threshold in the analysis in order to perform a binary method.
I think a stochastic threshold is useful, yes.
But do you have to have it?
You don't have to have it. You don't even have to have an analytical threshold. When we first developed STR analysis back in 93, 94, we didn't have any of those things. We relied on our primary data.
Okay, so and you said you try to comply with SWIG down when you can, correct?
Yes.
So, Judge, I know the state introduced earlier. The state introduced through you the 2010 SWIG down.
You have a copy of that?
I want to see what you introduced earlier.
Thank you.
There you go. I don't have the evidence.
You have it? Okay, so earlier, the state introduced Exhibit 12, which is the SWIG dam interpretation guidelines for autosomal STR typing by forensic DNA testing laboratories, correct?
Correct.
Autosomal?
No, AUTO, I don't know.
AUTOSOMAL. And did you give that to Mr. Raft? Was that your idea to use this or his, you know?
I believe it was his.
Okay. Do you know why he picked the 2010 guidelines?
There's certainly the guidelines that were in effect when this case was done.
Oh, I know, but your work you did in 16, correct? Your analysis.
Yes.
Okay. So let me show you what's been marked P for identification, and for the record, just reading it in, is the SWIG dam interpretation guidelines for autosomal STR typing by forensic DNA testing laboratories issued on January 12, 2017. Do you recognize that?
Yes.
And you believe that that's what's in effect today by SWIG dam for purposes of the same instruction by SWIG dam?
This is the current set of guidelines, yes.
Okay, I'd like to move that into evidence.
No objection.
I'm sorry?
All right, what's the ID? It's marked as Forbes P for identification. Will come in as Forbes 23.
than using the 2010, I'm going to ask you to use the January 2017 SWGDAM guidelines. And if you would, I'd ask you to turn to page 5, Roman numeral 8. And do you see where that says, the laboratory shall establish a stochastic threshold for use with binary methods?
Yes.
Okay. And you know in this case that Broward Sheriff's Office back in 2006 had no stochastic threshold, correct?
Incorrect.
Really? What was their stochastic threshold?
Their stochastic threshold was 150 RFU and 300 RFU.
Okay, I think you're in error. Where do you get that information? Where do you think you get that information from?
From the fact that the Broward Sheriff's Office uses what was in effect then, the guideline that allows a laboratory to establish an alternative method of determination of that information. The Broward Sheriff's Office uses what's called a DNA cutoff method, where they don't amplify less than a certain amount of DNA that functions as the analytical threshold. Their 150 RFU, 300 RFU, which they call the homozygote threshold, is in fact their stochastic threshold.
Okay, were you here when Heather Eric testified? I think you were, weren't you?
Yes.
Do you remember her testimony?
If you'll refresh my memory, that'll be fine.
Okay. I'd like you to look at the question and answer. The question's at the bottom of 24. This is Ms. Eric's testimony. The question's at the bottom of page 9, line 24, and the answer is over on the top of page 20, top of page 10. I'm sorry.
Yes, that's exactly what I just told you.
Well, I mean, so the question was, the stochastic threshold for a single peak was 300 RFUs, correct? And her answer is yes. The way Broward did it, we didn't break it into analytical threshold and stochastic threshold. We did it a bit differently, correct?
I told you they did it a bit differently, but the 150 and 300 are in fact their stochastic threshold.
Well, the 150 was really their analytical threshold, wasn't it?
No.
All right, I want to go back to your example of the A, B, C, D that Mr. Raff did with you, that apparently we lost the diagrams with. But do you remember his example of if he gives you 4 individuals, and I believe his example was at A and B, the individuals have a profile at 6 loci at 250 RFUs, and C and D have 3 loci at 50 RFUs. Do you remember that?
Yes.
And he asked you, can you do, or would you do, I guess, a 4-group hypothetical on that sample, right?
Yes.
And your answer was you would, but you would only do a 4-group hypothetical at 3 loci where all are represented, correct?
Correct.
And then you said you would do a likelihood ratio of what's the likelihood of it being A, B, C, and D, as opposed to 4 random people using only 3 loci, correct?
Correct.
And then I believe he asked you, why wouldn't you break it out? And you said, what do you think you said to that? I think you said you can't do it. You couldn't break it out individually, correct?
I think what I said was you can calculate that one of the advantages of likelihood ratio is you can set a number of different hypotheses and test them.
But do you remember him asking about breaking it out?
I don't specifically remember the question you're asking about.
Do you remember him asking you anything about breaking out those individuals?
I remember discussing that you could in fact develop different scenarios.
And he wasn't, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
One of those scenarios could be that you only know one of the individuals, which would mean there were 3 unknowns. But that was a discussion of knowns versus unknowns, as I recall.
And did you say you couldn't do that?
I don't think I said you couldn't do that. I said it wouldn't necessarily make sense to do that.
It wouldn't make sense to break out just one and see what his or her contribution is.
It doesn't give you that answer the way you think it does.
You don't know what I'm thinking. I'm just asking you, you're saying you wouldn't or couldn't break out A just to see what A's contribution is, correct?
If you break out A by itself, you're effectively assigning all the allele frequencies to unknowns, which means what you're really getting the answer for is unknowns, not necessarily the known. And you have to interpret it differently.
But you could get the percentage, the likelihood of it being A versus just A himself, right? You could get a weight for A, a statistical weight for A, I mean.
You would get a number for A as the only known in the mixture, but it wouldn't necessarily be the weight of A in that mixture, but more probably a representation of the fraction of contribution, which doesn't necessarily directly translate to the likelihood number. So it's very difficult. It's a very difficult concept to generally wrap your head around. But the point is that effectively what you're doing is you're taking all of the allele frequencies for the 4 individuals and you're assigning all but 2 of those allele frequencies to the unknowns. So you have 3 unknowns in the numerator and you have 4 unknowns, most of which have the same allele frequencies in the denominator, and you're taking all of that data and mixing and matching. The beauty of the likelihood ratio is you can establish any number of hypotheses for the prosecution, you can establish any number of hypotheses for the defense, and you can calculate those out and compare the answers. And you do not even have to have the same number of contributors to the prosecution as you have for the defense. So that literally becomes the as was pointed out yesterday in that article by Dr. Gill, it becomes the purview of the prosecution or whoever is writing the scenario for the numerator to say, this is what I believe the data means. And I believe the data means this, and this is the construction of the math that supports that. The defense or whoever is writing scenario 2 can say, no, I believe the data means this other thing. And they can construct the math for their belief of what that means. You can do the calculation and see which is more likely. That is one of the very great strengths of the likelihood ratio.
Right, but doesn't all the literature and guidelines suggest that you should the statistician should really do numerous hypotheses before you just report what's the likelihood of those 4, A, B, C, and D, versus 4 unknowns?
I think the literature says you can concoct any scenario you like. I'm not the person who can decide what something means or not mean. I'm presented with data. I'm given representatives that may or may not fit into that data. I construct a scenario based on that data. If other people, other defense experts, other people want to do their own mathematics and concoct their own scenarios. The beauty of it is they can take the very same data and recalculate it as many ways as they'd like.
But doesn't the literature and the guidelines suggest that with complex mixtures where one hypothesis may be very difficult to do, you should perform multiple hypotheses? Any expert, not just defense or prosecution.
I think what the literature tells you to do is construct the most reasonable hypothesis, and if other people want other things calculated, they can do that.
Okay, take a look at the Swigdam guidelines I just showed you, which is now, I don't know, 24. If you would look at page 56. And it's the likelihood ratio, the introduction of the likelihood ratio. Do you see that?
Yes.
Okay, so do you see the paragraph that begins with the LR, the likelihood ratio, right there?
I'm
Yes.
sorry, what page are you on again?
56. And you see where it says, the likelihood ratio may also be used to assess the DNA findings giving multiple POI together in a mixture. What's POI?
Persons of interest. That's exactly what
Right.
we're talking about. It
Okay.
says you can
Hang
group
on,
them together and do that.
Whoa, I'm going to read it. Stop. Read it. The specific formula of the LR, likelihood ratio, is dependent upon the evidence profile, the comparison reference profiles, and the individual hypotheses. There are scenarios where choosing one hypothesis over another may be difficult. This can occur with complex mixtures, paren, for example, more than 2 contributors, close paren, non-intimate or neutral evidence, paren, for example, where no assumptions of known contributors can be made, close paren, and or when there are multiple persons of interest, paren, for example, suspects or victims, close paren, being considered. Depending on the hypothesis and assumptions made, different likelihood ratios will result. In these instances, multiple hypotheses and likelihood ratios may be necessary for the case file in order for the court to determine which propositions are most appropriate. Do you see that?
I do.
Do you agree with that?
Absolutely.
Okay. So it wouldn't be proper then under that, you'd agree that A, B, C, D is a complex mixture, right? 4 people, 4 contributors.
Yes.
And isn't that Swigdam guideline telling you in that situation where assumptions are being made because you only got 3 loci and 6 loci, but isn't that exactly on point saying you should consider doing multiple hypotheses for the case file in order for the court to determine which propositions are most appropriate? Doesn't that guideline apply to that example A, B, C, D?
I think that it applies in a very complex way, and you've mixed a lot of interpretation together in your question. In order to answer your question, what I'd like to do is walk through these things and point out how they apply.
Do whatever you like, but I'm just asking, but it does apply. You agree that applies to the A, B, C?
I'm sorry, I object to him not allowing him to finish the answer. Before we move on to the next topic, Doctor, please answer the question.
I thought he did.
Huh? I'm
He
sorry.
said he would
Did
like
you-
to walk through to explain it, and I'd like him to do that.
What I'm asking is, but you agree that what I just read you applies to A, B, C, D, correct?
And I'm telling you that
That's just yes or no. I mean, I know that's difficult.
I'm sorry, Judge, I do have to object. The question that was actually asked that he's trying to retract now was not just whether it applied. The question was how it applied and to explain it.
No,
He's now
no,
backed
no,
off. You want
no,
to read the question?
No, yeah, please. My first question, because this is my examination, I can withdraw a question, but we can do it. I just don't want to waste the time right now. I would like to just answer this question yes or no, because it is a yes or no question. Can I ask the question and have him answer, Judge?
Vivian, where are you?
Right here.
All right, good. Let him ask the question, then we'll see where we're going.
Okay. Do what we just read, those guidelines, in your opinion, apply to the example he gave you of A, B, C, D?
they do.
Do you remember the example that we had yesterday of, excuse me for 1 second.
You know, I'm sorry, I forgot one question I wanted to ask you about, going back to that RC1A, just reminded myself I forgot to ask you this. That RC1A computation that you did in this case, where you put on the D3 the 1717, remember you?
Yes,
And you said that was obviously a typographical, that was an error, correct?
that was a typographical error, yes.
Was that peer reviewed by Dr. Tracy?
I do not believe that it was.
Who reviewed it?
I don't think I had anybody review it. I did that work. I discussed it with Dr. Tracy, but I did not show him the result.
Didn't you say, certainly in this testimony and deposition, that you always have someone review your work for check for typographical errors?
Typically, I always do. I did not in this case, and clearly I should have.
So we, as we sit here now, we would have no idea if that's the only place you didn't do that.
No, you would. That would be the only place I didn't do that.
The only mistake we caught so far is the only place that no one else reviewed it.
Yes.
It's just like a statistical anomaly, right?
Is that a question?
Yes. Isn't that a statistical anomaly? You just happen to make a mistake, and your mistake was the only place you didn't show it to another expert?
I think what it demonstrates is that it's the only thing that I didn't have outside reviewed, and I made a typographical error.
So do you remember yesterday or whatever day, I put in 21 in evidence where the state attorney's office, strike that, where defense 22 and 21 in evidence. Defense 22 was Martin Tracy's case review of Javon Gibson, where he reported a likelihood ratio including Mr. Day and Mr. Gibson over Mr. Day and an unknown, I believe, correct? Or two unknowns. I'm sorry, it's Mr. Day, Mr. Gibson, and an unknown over Mr. Day and two unknowns, correct?
Yes, that's what his report said.
Right, and you would have reviewed this because you reviewed for Dr. Tracy, correct?
I did not review this in November 2014.
You weren't doing reviews for him?
I did, but I didn't review this case.
Okay. And he gave a statistical weight to that, correct?
Yes.
1 in 25, correct?
Yes.
And then you recall that the Broward State Attorney's Office sent this out. Do you know who Niche Vision is?
It's Niche Vision, not Niche Vision. And it is a company that is the company that markets STR mix.
Right. And they sent that out for analysis, and Niche Vision formulated a response and indicated if you broke out Mr. Gibson from that likelihood ratio and did it independently, it showed that, in fact, he was likely excluded, correct?
Judge, I'm going to object this to outside the scope, beyond the scope of the rebuttal testimony. I don't see how any of this is related to the direct examination that was discussed regarding even probabilistic genotype. We've gone way far afield of where we're going.
No, this is right on point. He's talking about, he's telling us, I'm sure the court recognizes this, he's telling us the likelihood ratio is a valid way of analysis.
Good, let me answer it.
Okay, so do you agree with that, that Niche Vision, you dispute that that's the correct answer from Niche Vision, that when you break out Mr. Gibson, it turns out he's likely excluded, even though Dr. Tracy had him being 1 in 25 times more likely to be in that mixture?
There's two important points to be made.
Please make them.
Point number one, Niche Vision ran the likelihood ratio with 4 individuals in the group. Dr. Tracy ran it with 3. So we have a different number of contributors, which for the most part STR mix is somewhat insensitive to, but it will have an effect on the final number. Second, and more critically, Dr. Tracy said that the probability is 1 in 25, and for Javon Gibson with an additional contributor, and only in the black database, whereas the Hispanic and the Caucasian database were both inclusions. What that tells you is that neither number was a definitive answer as to the identification of the individual. Right? 1 in 25 is not a likelihood ratio that would give you any confidence about who was in or out of the mixture, and 0.606 doesn't give you any confidence as to who is in or out of the mixture. So both of these numbers are consistent, even though the likelihood ratios were actually calculated differently.
Okay, but nonetheless, he reported something that really, upon multiple hypotheses, like niche vision did, comes out that Gibson is really not accurately represented in that equation at all when you break them out individually, correct?
No,
They
that
didn't-
is not what I just told you.
No, I'm asking you. Niche vision determined that if you break out Mr. Gibson individually, he appears to be excluded when they run it through STR mix.
.606 does not exclude him. It doesn't tell you anything useful. Neither does Dr. Tracy's number. That's what I told you. I did not tell you he was excluded.
Give me one more. Right, so you have that report, I'm sorry, I think it's 21, Forbes 21, the niche vision in front of you.
Yes.
Go to page 2, the summary. And you see where they have one A, B, C, or, and this are their conclusions, their summary of conclusions says, or the DNA evidence is at least 1.65 times more likely if it originated from
1.56.
1.65 times more likely if it originated from 4 unknown individuals than if it originated from Javon Gibson and 3 unknowns. Did you see that?
Yes,
Do you agree with that?
that's their report. I have
Right.
no background information to do any other interpretation, but that would be the 4 individuals, yes.
Okay, so you would think the STR mix is working accurately, right? And niche vision knows what they're doing with STR mix.
What I do know is that at the time this report was run, they were also using metrics for the various variables in the equations that were not yet validated by BSO.
So you think the state attorney's office sent their data out to some unfounded, irresponsible lab, is that what you're saying?
I'm not saying that at all.
Okay. So again, would you agree with their analysis? You think their analysis is on point?
I think their analysis can be used as discussion. It doesn't tell you anything about the individuals in the mixture.
So that information that I just read you don't think is a valid point?
I think it tells you that you don't know anything about the people in the mixture.
But it also says it's more likely as 4 unknowns than Mr. Gibson and 3 unknowns.
Again, I'll make the same objection that we're going far afield of rebuttal, assuming the court found any of this relevant.
Well, no, Judge, again, this is exactly what we're taught. This is the heart of our case.
Not only is it beyond the
Let him answer. He knows how to answer questions.
Isn't that what it says?
1.6 times is effectively saying both scenarios are equal.
Really? It's saying it's 1.5 more times more likely it came from 4 unknowns than Javon Gibson and 3 unknowns. That's what it says, right?
Yeah, but that's not even 2 times more likely.
I didn't ask you for any computations right now. I'm just asking if that's what it says. Am I reading it correctly?
You are reading it correctly, but
Thank
your
you, sir.
interpretation is incorrect.
Okay, well, you and I will disagree about that. That'll be for the court to decide. Now, you said you downloaded LR Mix because it was free, correct?
Correct.
And STR Mix is certainly a very expensive genotype software program, correct?
Correct.
And by downloading LR Mix, you were able to acquire a genotype software, and then, like you said, you used it in your mind only as a calculator, correct?
Correct.
But yet it does computations for you, correct?
Yes.
earlier, I think you saw this report from Dr. Gill, Defense 20, Forbes 20, right? Mr. Raff showed that to you earlier?
Yes.
Okay. If you would look at page 4, please. Now, you recall earlier, Mr. Raff asked you about this report and said, look through it and see where it says you can't use it as a calculator. And you obliged and said, well, I can't find that in here, correct?
Correct.
So did you read the second paragraph under number 7, which reads as follows? In addition, the likelihood ratio analysis has been carried out using 6 out of 15 STR loci selected from the multiplexes. In carrying out that calculation, there is an implicit assumption that the loci that are not included in the calculation are neutral. However, by following this procedure, there is an inevitable prosecution bias that renders the results of the analysis to be potentially misleading. Do you agree with that?
No. It is clear that Dr. Gill was not given the complete information on how I interpreted my electropharogram.
Did you use 6 loci, 6 out of 15 loci on GT 37.1? You want to take a minute to re-examine yours?
I probably used 6 loci.
Okay.
Is that GT or JT?
JT 37.1. And that was a 2-person mixture, correct?
I believe so. I would have to check that.
And the major part of the profile was attributed to Andre Delancy, and the minor was attributed to Mr. Forbes, correct?
Again, I'd have to look at my
You
report
can
to
look at it.
confirm.
Go ahead. JT 37.1.
Are we talking about the BSO data or Mr. Keel's data?
I believe this was all BSO data. But I'm talking about your report of JT 37.1. Not anyone's data, just what your report is.
Yes,
You agree it was a 2-person mixture, correct?
I do.
And you agree you agreed that the major was Mr. Delancy and the minor was Mr. Forbes, correct?
I agree that the major was Mr. Delancy and that there was a mixture of Mr. Delancy and Mr. Forbes.
Right. So the minor was Mr. Forbes, correct?
Mr. Forbes was included in the mixture. I didn't distinguish his profile as an overall minor profile. If I had, I would have run a random man calculation.
But you just said the major was Mr. Delancy, right?
Correct.
Okay. And that's what Dr. Gill has in his 7, that it's a 2-person mixture. The major is Andre Delancy, the minor is Bernard Forbes, and he then comments on your likelihood ratio, correct?
He does.
Okay. So now let me just get to this, the final points that Mr. Raff made when he was talking about the probabilistic genotyping software. And you told us earlier that this is an example, the probabilistic genotyping software is an example of software that places in some value to loci where there could be dropout, I guess, and it presumes there might be, and then, like you said, it inserts maybe a 10% chance that some allele should be there, correct?
Correct.
And yet, in the example you gave, you've already done that, and you've interpreted it as having no dropout at that loci, correct?
I think you're mixing things together there. I'm not sure what you're asking.
Well, the example that Mr. Raff gave to you was, the example that he gave you with, there are certain loci and then, hang on, I'll get it for you.
Are you thinking of the A and B?
No. Give me a minute, my notes. Right, no, Mr. Rapp was asking you about your use of LR Mix Studio, correct?
Yes.
And he said, in some of the samples, in one of the samples, I think, you determined that there was no dropout occurring, and therefore you only used the 3 loci where all the individuals were represented.
Yes, in that ABCD example he gave.
Yeah, I don't know if this was still ABCD though, but I don't think it was. But in any event, and you then zero out the probability for dropout in the LR Mix Studio in order to use it in the fashion that you use it, correct?
Correct.
And you said the problem with, or the difference with the genotyping software is it might plug in a number there and therefore give some like higher number.
Correct.
So in essence, you're favoring the defense, if you will, in that situation. That was your implication, correct?
Absolutely.
Right. So if I understood that correctly, then what you're saying is you're able to sort of do this better than the STR mix or genotyping software because you're more accurate at the loci where you can determine there's dropout and STR mix can't.
No. What I'm saying is that when I go through and I do a complete examination of the evidence profile, and I see that there is data there where there may be dropout, and I look to see that that data does not exclude the defendant, when I don't include the loci that do not exclude the defendant in the statistical calculation, I'm being conservative because I am not inflating the final number by data where there is dropout. In STR mix or other probabilistic softwares that include that data, they'll assign a weight to those alleles because I know they don't exclude the defendant. They'll assign a weight to drop in and therefore give a much higher number to the final analysis than I would. I am doing a much more conservative analysis than STR mix would do.
But it's based on your ability to discern no dropout when, for example, others may not be able.
It is based on my ability to accurately interpret an electropherogram.
Right, so this genotyping software was invented for really everybody except Dr. McElfresh because he can do it better than those others that really require it.
Objection argumentative.
Yeah, rephrase that and try to be nice. Well, you know, it's a little insulting when you're just saying to the witness, everybody but him.
Well, that's what it seems like he's saying. Well, so the
Just ask another question.
The genotyping software, you don't need it then. I mean, you can do all this better than the genotyping software, correct?
Forensic DNA analysts do this every day all over the country without this software.
And so, for example, you agree that Broward Sheriff's Office Crime Lab is going to STR mix, correct?
Yes.
And around the country, every lab is going to STR, or not every lab, but many labs are now utilizing STR mix genotype software for complex mixtures, correct?
I know that laboratories are assessing various possible probabilistic genotyping softwares.
And the reason is it more accurately reflects the computations and calculations for the complex mixtures that were the reason for the creation of genotyping software.
Objection is to relevance at this point. Again, we're going, since no probabilistic genotyping was done here, and even to the extent that you're questioning about it, I think the question is irrelevant to these procedures.
Where is this relevant?
It's relevant to his determination of whether he should use LR mix as a software, as a genotyping software, he was using as a calculator.
Then you can ask him that question about LLM. It's not a general question about other labs moving. The question was about labs moving.
Well, you already answered that question.
No, this is cross-examination, Judge. It's a valid point.
As long as we're moving on.
Can you answer that question? Like
I can tell you that probabilistic software programs are being developed to assist especially analysts with very little training and very little experience to be able to perform at a level that an experienced analyst would, and that experienced forensic DNA analysts all over the country every day interpret complex mixtures without any software whatsoever.
So Broward Sheriff's Office has inexperienced analysts?
Broward Sheriff's Office has excellent analysts. Obviously, if you can adopt a tool to help even experienced analysts, that's a good thing too.
And you're aware that based upon some of this genotype software analysis, many of the jurisdictions, including Broward Sheriff's Office Crime Lab, have now gone back and notified thousands of defendants that some of the computations may have been done incorrectly. You aware of that?
I have no way of knowing that.
You've not heard of that? I'm the first person to tell you that?
Objection, now we're calling for a hearsay answer. He's telling him, he's saying, haven't other people told you that? How much clearer does that have to be?
No, not
Objection,
other
hearsay.
people told you that. You work with the Broward Sheriff's Office Crime Lab, correct?
Yes.
And you're aware that well, we've already gone through this, but just to be a little repetitive, you're aware of the complaint Ms. Roy made, right?
I am.
You're aware of the conclusion Ashclad made that she was correct?
Objection, this line of questioning outside the scope
Now,
of...
let's get to specifics.
Well, this is...
Wait. You're right, this is cross.
Right.
But this is cross of a rebuttal witness.
Right.
And you're limited to what was raised on direct.
Right, and what was raised on direct is this is the only man, he's the only man that can outsmart genotype software. That's what he's testifying to.
And
That's
Judge,
what I've heard,
and if he wants to make
Well,
that
that's what I've
argument,
heard.
that's fine for
It's an
argument.
argument.
Thank you.
No, I'm not asking him that. That's why I'm demonstrating this through the cross-examination. You tell me when I should sit down and stop asking questions.
Can I do that?
Yes, anytime you're ready.
That's a good question, William.
You work with the Broward Sheriff's Office Crime Lab, correct?
I do.
And are you not aware that, based on what we just discussed, that they've now are in the process of implementing STR software to be able to report complex mixtures?
Asked and answered.
That happens to be sustained. Next question.
Okay, so based on that they're utilizing STR mix to now be able to report complex mixtures again, are you aware that they've also had to report out that some of their conclusions based on old analysis, like you do, are false?
Objection to relevance.
If he knows.
I don't know the answer, and I certainly don't know of a specific case where that's happened. It has not been brought to my attention.
Just give me a minute. Okay, you were shown the emails from Ms. Roy to Dr. Gill, correct? Yeah.
I don't.
At some point,
I know he knows of them, I don't know if he's actually reviewed them.
I thought you did look at them earlier.
He'll didn't
Julie,
know what it was.
wait. You know, you guys got have a cross conversation, but the person who needs to answer is sitting on the
I'm
stand.
sure he states 10. Have you ever seen these emails?
I have.
Okay. So look at the very first one, if you would, please.
Okay.
I don't actually have a copy of that, so.
Yeah, sure.
So that I can follow along too.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you see this?
Because I don't know, you said the first one, we follow the same order?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
The first one, February 21st, Ms. Ford writes, I'm working on a number of cases.
Objection is to relevancy at this point. He's gonna ask, I don't have any idea where this is going, so.
Well, that's why you have to hear the question, and then you can object.
If part of the question is reading the, I'll withdraw the objection.
Well, how? Right. I'm working on a number of cases in South Florida which involve what I believe to be improper use of the LR Studio program. I know you've been one of the scientists instrumental in the creation of this program. Among other grievous errors, the two individuals holding
Wait, slow down, I'm gonna move it up. One other grievous.
errors, the two individuals holding themselves out as population geneticists with expertise in forensic statistics gave sworn testimony yesterday. They do not need to validate the LR Studio as described by national and internal working group standards because they are dropping all loci where they believe dropout to have occurred rather than using probabilities for dropout and drop in. Instead, any loci inconsistent with their hypothesis are dropped and they put a value of 1 for that locus. They allege by dropping all loci where dropout is suspected or present, this removes the probabilistic nature of the program, and as such, it will be akin to using a calculator. I know this to be incorrect. Despite the fact these individuals have had no training on the program and appear to have very little knowledge of probabilistic genotyping systems in general, they have used LR Studio unvalidated in a way that I have described to craft some extremely misleading.
Mr. Mulder,
I'm
slow
sorry.
down. In a way,
In the way that I have described, to craft some extremely misleading and fundamentally flawed likelihood ratios on casework samples submitted to them by a local laboratory, which they intend to present as evidence in trial. The current case on which I have been retained is the death penalty case. I reached out to John Buckleton and Charlotte Word for counsel regarding this issue, and both suggested I speak to you directly. If you are willing to consult on this case, I would like to recommend to the defense attorney that we bring you on for the purpose of providing pretrial testimony and an evidentiary hearing about proper and accepted use application of the LR Studio program as compared to how it is being employed in the present case. I wanted to approach you both before suggesting this to the attorney to ensure this is something you're willing and able to do. Would you be willing to help us? Please let me know. We would be willing to accommodate your schedule and pursue options for remote testimony if necessary. There are a number of cases affected by this issue, and it's vital that we set the precedent for proper use of this program. And then, did you see Dr. Gill's answer? Hi, Tiffany. Yes, you are right. You cannot use LR Mix or any other probabilistic software in the way that is described because there is nothing published that would approve that practice, and it's important for laboratories to follow national guidance to internally validate software before use. I can write a note to that effect if you furnish me with sufficient details. I do not think I need to get involved with analysis of the profiles in question, given that the test seems to be invalid under the conditions you described. And he goes on to say he doesn't travel very much. Did you read that?
I did.
Okay, so you don't think that comments on your use of the LR Studio?
I think Dr. Gill was given horrific misinformation by somebody who has no idea what they're talking about.
Okay, thank you very much. I have nothing further.
Go back there.
Go back. How long is yours going to be?
Anywhere from a half an hour to an hour. Try to make it the half.
If you're gonna go fast, I'm not gonna.
What are you talking about?
I mean, if you're gonna try to squish an hour to a half hour, I'm leaving.
You speak fast, is what she's saying.
Yeah, she's just saying slow down. All right, give it a shot.
Good afternoon, Dr. McElroy.
Good afternoon.
I think it's been a long time ago since the last time I spoke to you. You've been cross-examined and examined by other people. Just want to make sure, if I recall correctly, or during the time I got to cross-examine you previously, you acknowledged that when you solve for 4 people or 3 people or 2 people in a mixture, but not to them individually, but just as them as a group under a likelihood ratio, the net result of what you get can be interpreted as they are either not excluded, as to the individual, they are not excluded, or they are included, but there is no mathematical statistic as to that individual.
That is correct. The way I do the calculations, that is correct.
Okay. So synthesizing that long phrase that I just did, basically these calculations using likelihood ratio as to 2, 3, or 4 people, mixtures in this case, we can synthesize it down to as they are either included or not excluded without any numerical value or statistical value given to that individual.
The statistic is for the group of individuals collectively as they appear in the DNA sample.
But as to what I said, that's a correct statement, correct?
No statistic is given for the individual.
And all the best you can say is that they are not excluded or they're included.
I can tell you that as a group, they're included with the statistic I calculated. That is all I can tell you.
But as to the individual, that person is included, but not with the statistical number associated with it.
Not for the individual, no.
Okay. So I'm being correct, though. So I'm getting.
Okay, I think you are.
Okay.
The fact of the matter is I'm not giving you a statistic for each individual in the mixture, just for the mixture as a whole.
And you're saying they're not excluded.
That's correct.
Okay. Now, do you have Dr. Gill's report, or whatever you want to call it? Has that been given to you up there? I have a lot of stuff sitting.
I do.
I think it was.
Yes, I have it here.
Okay. Will you do me a favor and read number 2 on the first page? What is likelihood ratio?
A likelihood ratio weighs the evidence in favor of competing hypotheses or propositions, one from the prosecution perspective and one from the defense. It compares how probable the observed evidence is under each proposition. So in the case of a DNA profile, you would evaluate, assuming the DNA comes from the suspect, what is the probability of seeing the match? Assuming the DNA was from someone else, what is the probability of seeing the match? The likelihood ratio is obtained by dividing A by B. If the answer is larger than one, the prosecution's version of the events is better supported. If it's lower than 1, the defendant's is.
Do you agree with that statement?
Yes.
Okay. Let's go to our friendly easel, if we can. Do we have that marked in any place?
I'm sure we do. I know that it might be actually in the...
Is it on the end of the counter down
I got one right here. We'll do it in red.
That one's dying, just so you know. Or,
No, that's
oh, no, that's a good one. All right,
That's
fine.
Is the green one working?
there? Yeah, green.
Okay, we'll do it in green. Thank you. Now, I think you said that when you do this statistical analysis using likelihood ratio, the numerator, the way you do it, is always 1.
No, I said it can be 1. It doesn't have to be 1, but most often is 1 if you have a complete profile.
Okay, the bottom line is the way you've done it in this case, in which that you only look at the loci in which all 3 or 4 people are represented in that mixture, that ends up with a 1, correct?
In this case, that's true. It ends up with a 1.
Okay, so we have a numerator of a 1. How do we get to the denominator?
The denominator is based on the number of peaks and the number of individuals who could be contributors.
Okay. Let's just say for one loci, you have 4 people, okay? And to make the math real easy, let's do 1 is a 1, 2, next one is a 2, 3, next one is a 3, 4, and the 4th one is a 1, 4. Okay, because, is that fine with you?
It is, but it doesn't make the math easy.
Okay. Anyhow, how do we assign for that one loci the 1, 2 person? I mean, what, you take the probability of a 1 being in?
No.
What
no.
do you do? How does the formula go?
The formula is based on now in the denominator, you've assigned genotypes to individuals, except in the numerator, we've said, okay, those are the genotypes for the individuals, but because we know who they are, that's a 1. In the denominator, right?
Please.
If you don't mind.
I want you to, because I don't understand how you get the denominator.
Okay, so the denominator, we have a peak at, we're going to call it 1. We have a 2. What is that?
That's a 2. Terrible 2, but it's a 2.
Okay, let's clear that.
Thank you.
All right. So we have a peak at 1, we have a peak at 2, we have a peak at 3, and we have a peak at 4.
Okay.
All right? So we have 4 peaks and 4 individuals.
And we know that there's 4 individuals because somewhere else in the electroparagram we've seen enough to determine 4. Correct?
Okay. So now, this equation is probably going to go on for several pages.
Okay.
All right? But let's make it sort of simplistic.
Please.
And say that what are the possible genotypes that can contribute here? Right? So we could have 4 individuals, one of whom is a 1, he's a homozygote, and we'll call this P. So this individual would be P squared. All right?
Okay.
This individual would be, we'll call this Q, that would be Q squared. This would be R, so that would be R squared, and we'll call this S, so that would be S squared. Okay? Now that's just the homozygotes.
Okay, and now we give a mathematical value to the P, the R, and the Q, and the S?
We do, but P, Q, R, and S can occur in any order, can't they?
Sure.
Okay, so person 1 could be P squared, or person 1 could be Q squared. Right? So there are a whole series of possible ways that you could have these individuals, right? For the sake of argument, I think it's 12, right? I would check. I'm calculating, that's 12. Right, 4 times 3 times 2, 12, 24, sorry.
Well, note for the record, Judge, based on everything that's already happened, that if we're going to do this on the fly again,
right,
the state's going to object to the mathematical computations on the fly unless the doctor's going to say he's very comfortable he can do that.
I'm telling you that this is exactly why I use LR mix.
And I'm not,
all right?
Good, now we have all that straightened out. Go ahead, answer the question.
Hold on a second. I'm not asking you for a definitive number on anything. I just want to know how the formula is done. That's all I'm asking.
Okay, well, the formula is done by first figuring out what's the probability for all the homozygotes, right? But we could have, now, we could have someone who is a P squared, right? That accounts for 1. Then we could have a 2, 3, which would be QR, right? 2QR, right?
Are you multiplying these or are they added?
These are multiplied at the moment. We're going to add in a minute. But what we do is we grid out all possible genotypes, right?
Okay.
And I told you, this is going to go on for pages if you're going to make me work all the way through it. And then I'm going to tell you I don't want to work all the way through it. The point is this. You have all the possible genotypes that could contribute to a 4-peak pattern. And you have to take all of that data and collect it and that becomes your denominator, which is why when I said you do hundreds of factors, that's how you get it.
When do you do the adding?
At the very end, after you've collected all of your information, you add up all that information to say, how many p squareds do I have, how many q squareds, how many r squareds, how many s squareds, how many pq squareds, or 2pqs, 2pqrs squared, all of them.
Okay, but that's after you've done the multiplication.
After you've done all of this for each of them. Okay? So you're multiplying this, you have 24 times p squared, q squared, r squared, s squared, and that's your first.
Okay, but let me get to where I want to get to.
Okay?
Okay. P is going to be a number less than 1, correct?
Yes.
It has to be.
Yes.
So p squared is going to be a number far less than 1.
Yes.
Okay. And then you're going to multiply it by q squared, which is a number, q is a number less than 1.
It's going to be the square of the allele frequency for q in the population.
But it's a number
No,
less
no,
than
no, no, no. The square of the what? You slow down.
Sorry about that. The square of the allele frequency in the population.
Okay. So q is going to be less than 1, so therefore q squared is going to be far less than 1. Right?
Yes.
Okay. R squared, r is going to be less than 1, r squared is going to be far less than 1.
Yes.
Okay. And if we're dealing with numbers, say, that p squared comes, p comes 0.13.
Okay.
Okay, let's do 0.15 because it's an easier mathematical equation. So then when you multiply it, what do you get? When you try to p squared, that'd be 0.3 times 0.13.
No, it's 0.15 squared.
Right. So that gets you to
0.15 times 0.15, which is, again,
0.00225.
Time out. Okay, if you're looking for how low this number is going to be, it's going to be remarkably small. But your numerator is 1, so you're going to take the inverse. So for explanatory purposes, if this number were 0.01, 1 over 0.01 is 100.
Whatever. The bottom line is no matter how you do this, the denominator, the way you do it, the denominator is always going to be less than the numerator.
Not always.
Yes, it is.
Well,
Yes, it is. You're wrong on that one.
no, listen carefully. You made a blanket statement. In this case, right? Once you add all these things together, if this number adds up to higher than 1 because you have very large allele frequencies, it might be less than 1. In a paternity case, think about it this way. The probability that the man is the father is 0.5. He either is or he isn't the father, right? So there's your two choices, 0.5. If the allele frequency that he passed to the child happens to be 0.85, then the probability that he's the father is less than 1. The point is, the thing about the likelihood ratio is that it's all about how you set it up.
And what I'm saying is the way you set it up, where you discount all, where you discount all the loci in which you don't have the 4 people in the mixture accounted for when you do your math, and you set up the numerator as 1. You say it is possible that the denominator will be greater. You haven't found that to be the case in anything in this case, have you?
That's true in this case.
Okay. What is the frequency when you have done that in other cases, using 4 people or 3 people mixtures, that you've gotten the denominator to be larger than the numerator? How about never?
How about wrong answer?
How about those never?
I'm going to have to object. I understand asking a question and getting an answer, but then saying you don't like the answer, I think that's inappropriate.
How about close to never?
I have no idea.
It depends entirely on how the likelihood ratio is calculated for that particular case.
Given your statistics, how many times have you done it to solve for a 4-person mixture or a 3-person mixture in which you have discounted all the loci in which those 3 or 4 people are not included totally in that mixture? Have you gotten where the denominator is larger? What percentage?
If he knows.
Well, he should know, it's his data.
You're
The
asking
predicate-
for all cases. I don't know how he's going to remember all that.
The predicate for your question is incorrect.
Because he's smart.
How many times when you've done this type of calculation is the denominator larger than the numerator And how many times would you say it's the converse? In a percentage?
The predicate for your question is incorrect. You're basing your question on the fact that the assumption is that data not used in the equation would somehow make the number less. What I testified to earlier, and that you need to remember, is that I've evaluated all the data in the case, and it would include that individual. So what would happen is when I do the calculation as they've been done in this case, is I get a very conservative answer. Your assumption is that if I used all that other data, somehow it would make this number so large that it would make it less than 1. In fact, if I used that data and imputed the drop in and drop out, I would get a number far larger than I calculate here.
Well, I thank you for answering a question I did not ask whatsoever. Simply stating what is the percentage when you do the calculation that you've done in this case that your numerator is larger than your denominator. And all the times you've done this type of formula, solving for 3 or 4 people, what is the percentage?
I have to object to the form of the question. He asked them both. In the beginning he asked about this case, but at the end the question was as to all cases.
I said all cases.
And I think you switch numerator and denominator.
It does not matter, does it?
It does.
Why?
And the answer is, I have indeed gotten the situation where the answer is less than 1.
You have indeed done it. What percentage, indeedly, have you done it?
I cannot give you a percentage. I
10%?
I cannot give you a percentage.
5%?
I cannot give you a percentage.
1%?
There's no objection to the form of the question. Again, the witness has answered 3 times. He can't do.
Is it vastly more common that the numerator is larger than the denominator in the way you do it?
I cannot give you a percentage, sir. I know the question you're asking, but I cannot give you the answer. I don't have the answer to give you.
Not in the percentage. Is it vastly more common in the way you do it that your numerator is larger than your denominator?
Objection asked and answered.
I didn't get an answer yet.
He may not have liked the answer, but he got it.
Doctor?
I cannot give you an answer to that question in any mathematical terms
I didn't
whatsoever.
ask for a mathematical term.
Then I told you it does happen, and it has happened, and I have calculated it.
And I'm asking you, but is the one where you get the numerator is larger, do you come to that conclusion in a vast majority of your times that you do it? Without a numerical number.
I honestly can't give you that answer.
Yeah, you could, you just don't want to.
Objection to the commentary.
Now back to Mr. Gill's report. You turn to page 3. You there?
Yes.
Okay, you see where number 6 starts?
Yes.
Will you read 2 bullet points or paragraphs above that? Note
Note that there is a difficulty in that there may be closely related individuals to consider in the set, which would increase the complexity of the calculations if this were taken into consideration.
Okay. Do you agree with that statement?
It could if that applied, yes.
Okay, well, we do have Mr. Ingraham and Mr. Ingraham's son, correct?
Correct.
So that would apply, wouldn't it?
It applies in the numerator, which is set to 1 in this particular case for that particular calculation. So it's accounted for because we've explained all the individuals in the mixture.
How would you explain the relationship between Mr. Ingraham and his son, regardless of the numerator or any place? How would you explain that?
It cannot be regardless of the numerator. It is the numerator. And they are individuals wherein the hypothesis is they're included in the mixture and their reference sample explains the peaks that exist. Therefore, the answer is 1. Doesn't matter what the relationship is. The defense hypothesis would be that these are 4 random individuals, and therefore there is no relationship to consider.
So what you're saying, if I understand it, is that if we were solving for an individual, that would have a great bearing on our numbers?
If we were solving for a relationship between individuals, yes.
Well, if we're solving for the individual as to, in this four-person mixture, I want to know what the likelihood is of Mr. Ingraham alone being in that mixture, meaning I don't care about the other three people. The fact that his son may be in the mixture, we have to factor that in.
Not the way you presented that hypothesis.
So,
Because what you're saying is it's Mr. Ingraham and three unknowns. If you don't know who they are, you can't assume a relationship.
so then, under that sentence that you agreed with, when does that take place?
It would take place if, in fact, your hypothesis requires a relationship. If your defense hypothesis were that they're not unknown individuals, but they are a father and a son, then you would take that into account, for example.
Can you please explain that to me? I really didn't understand what you said.
If you have a specific hypothesis that includes a specific relationship between two of the individuals, then you would include that calculation as part of your hypothesis or your mathematics. But that isn't the case here.
Okay. Now, Mr. Moldoff showed you that Javon Gibson, thank you. And apparently, Dr. Tracy found that there was a 25 times more likelihood that it was Mr. Gibson in the mixture.
Yes.
Okay, and then and you always use the database that's most favorable to the defendant, correct?
Correct.
So we have to assume that the 25, the number that Dr. Tracy came up with, was the database most favorable to the defendant.
We would.
Okay, and so therefore, when they did this under niche vision.
Niche vision, yes.
Okay, and they come up with the 0.6.
Yes.
We'd have to assume that they're also using the database most favorable. I think it's right there.
Yes, I believe that is. They used the black database, which was most favorable in this case.
Okay, now you're saying that statistically, there's really little difference there.
That's correct.
Okay, what we have is the 25 is versus the 0.6. It really comes down to like a 30-some-odd times difference.
What those numbers tell you...
Am I right?
Yes, but you've incorrectly interpreted.
Well, I'm right that I could not have incorrectly interpreted. It was a mutually exclusive.
No, they're
But
not.
anyhow, if I ask you this, as far as the interpretations though, there is a drastic difference. And that is the one that Dr. Tracy gave out there. That's a positive association, while the one that Niche Vision gave is a negative association. Correct?
Mathematically correct, interpretationally wrong.
Terminology correct, also correct.
But your interpretation is wrong.
But my statement is correct.
You can be correct all you want, it's still an incorrect interpretation.
Well, I enjoy being correct. But it's correct. A 25 times more likely is a positive association, one that favors the state, correct?
No, not in this case. 25 doesn't favor the state enough to say that you can call it a positive association. That's the problem. Yes, it's a positive number, but it is a number so low as to be meaningless with regard to what it actually tells you about the inclusion of the individual, just as the reverse is true as well.
Well, what it tells you, we're interested in what it would tell a jury. The jury would hear a positive association using Dr. Tracy's work and hear a negative association using Niche Vision.
I'll judge in the form of the question. He's not going to answer questions regarding how the jury's going to proceed. He's only being asked questions about the science. Could we stick just to that?
I didn't ask perceive, I said hear.
The question was in reference to how the jury would proceed.
If he can answer it, let him answer it.
What the jury would hear from me were I testifying about this is that that association carries no weight with regard to the inclusion or exclusion of the individual in the mixture.
And if you were asked a specific question, is 25 a positive association, your answer would be yes it is, correct?
In this instance, it is an association of no meaning.
Okay, and if you were asked the question, is 0.6 a negative association, the answer would be yes.
It would be, it's an association of no meaning.
But if you had Mr. Moldoff asking you the questions and he said, just give me your yes or no answer, it would be yes to both of my questions.
Object to the form of the question, argumentative.
Correct.
It would be an association of no meaning.
Now, you made a comment or testimony before that the entire story of the sample is written on the electropharogram.
Yes.
Okay. And that is the entire electropharogram, not just the loci that you're using, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And then when you were talking with Mr. Williams before, you made comments such as, low level of a second individual, we will assume there is a 14. Remember, you said that as to D19.
I believe what I was talking about there is that that peak could be a low level, and if it is, it's a 14. It doesn't necessarily mean that it is, rather just an overall assessment of what I'm looking at.
Right, and that's what I'm getting to. I'm not going to go through the example. It's just terminology that you've used. You said on another one, could be noise.
Yes.
Okay. You didn't say it was noise. You say it could be noise, correct?
Sure.
Okay. So when you're looking at an electropharogram and you're interpreting it, you're acknowledging that there can be times when you say it's noise and it really isn't noise, or you say it's not noise and it is noise, because you use the term could be, correct?
I'm acknowledging that every interpretation is unique with regard to the electropharogram you're looking at.
And you're certainly not saying that you're infallible, correct?
I think we've proved that.
Okay. Now, you said that one of the downsides, I guess, of using LR Mix Studio or Star Mix is the possibility that it imputes data that may or may not be there.
That's certainly a possibility, yes.
Okay. Now, doing it the way you do with classifying some things as noise that may not be noise, things like that, you may be leaving out data that actually may be there, correct?
I'm specifically eliminating data that is incomplete but not exclusionary. And that means that when you run a model-making software like STRMix especially, that it will model that data as there and give it a weight, and therefore provide additional weight in favor of the hypothesis that it's calculating. And that's something I don't do, which is more conservative.
Okay, but still, my statement is correct, isn't it? I know you don't like my correct statements, but my statement is correct that you may be leaving out data that might be there. True or false?
That's true.
Okay. Now, let's talk about STRMix for a second. FBI uses that now, don't they?
It is my understanding that yes, they do.
Okay, and you were here when we had Heather Eric testify by Skype or whatever the means were.
Yes.
Okay. Now, she did the initial analysis in this case over 10 years ago, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And she wasn't brand new at this at that time. She had been an analyst for a while, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So therefore, we can, and I forgot when she said that she started, but I think it was fair to say that it's at least 15 years that she's been doing this.
That seems certainly possible.
Okay. So, is she an inexperienced analyst?
Objection for calling him to ask him to give the opinion of another analyst.
So that she is inexperienced?
That's all he asked. What?
I would say that she's an experienced analyst.
Experienced or inexperienced?
Experienced.
Okay. So the FBI though is now turning to STR mix, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And you, I believe, said that that is to help the inexperienced analyst.
As well as the experience.
Okay. So Broward Sheriff's Office is using STR mix now, correct?
They will be soon.
Are you saying that the way you do it, the way you analyze it, the way Dr. Tracy analyzes it, is better or more accurate than an experienced analyst such as Miss Eric LaSalle up at the FBI using STR mix?
I'm saying that all of us are experienced analysts using the tools at hand to do the very best job that we can do.
Okay, and you did not answer the question again.
I really thought I did.
No, the question is Heather Eric, let me ask you this, as an experienced analyst, would Heather Eric need to use STR mix?
No, she wouldn't need to use it.
Okay. Would you believe that all the analysts up at the FBI are experienced?
I don't even know all of the analysts at the FBI. Don't think I can speak to that.
Do you believe that the FBI is in the habit of hiring inexperienced analysts?
Again, I'm going to have to renew the objection.
Well, let's move on, please.
You made a comment early on today with Mr. Rath that the difference between the analytical threshold and the stochastic threshold may be that the random effect that you may not be able to explain. There may be data there. Is that what you're trying to say?
I think what I was trying to say, if I remember properly at this point, is that there are, between the analytical and the stochastic threshold, there can be phenomena that you need to pay special attention to. You may get imbalance, you may get dropout, you may get other things that require special attention in that region of the electropherogram.
David, I think you used the phrase that you may not be able to explain.
It's possible that you might not be able to explain.
Okay. Now, doesn't STR mix explain that or put it into its calculations?
I think that STR mix would attempt to put it into the calculation, but it would give that result very little weight, which is exactly what I would do if I were interpreting, or in fact what I would probably do is consider that locus unusable for statistics.
If STR mix becomes the standard that all labs use, what does that do as far as the need for you?
Objection is to speculation in the future if STR mix become.
Well, it seems to be, from what I've heard today, that becomes a pattern.
Again, I'll renew my objection that we're way beyond the cross-examination of rebuttal at this point. Talking about probabilistic genotyping software and what is going to happen in the future, my objection is it's not relevant and it calls for a speculative answer.
Mr. Raff on direct exam asked him about STR mix and about what the value of it and what he does that STR mix doesn't do or can do.
You guys finished?
Yes.
You can answer the question.
I think what it means is I'll get my Wednesday afternoons and my Thursday afternoons back instead of being here testifying about probabilistic software.
Because there'll be less of a need for you, correct?
I certainly hope so.
And I would expect so. Thank you very much.
I'm afraid to ask you, how much redirect do you think you have?
I think it's 10 after 5, and I think I'm done. We are finished. Thank you.
Take care of that. Whether this means you get your Wednesdays and Thursdays back, I don't know. But for the moment, you're out of here.
Bless you, sir.
Oh, no, thank them.
I do have questions. I asked for the grace, now that I didn't keep us here till whenever it was you would have.
About what? From who?
regarding the issue of closing argument.
We'll talk about that in a minute.
Okay.
Are there any other witnesses?
No.
Mr. Williams, you calling anybody?
No.
Mr. Aronson?
No.
Next one scares me. Mr. Moldoff?
If I did, Judge, it'd be very brief, but I don't know now. I'd have to talk to Ms. Roy overnight.
Oh, tomorrow we're picking up with closings.
Well, then you won't let me if I ask to, but I can't decide now. There's no way I can possibly tell you right now.
I have not objected to a single request that Mr. Moldoff has made, but I am going to object. I got to have some kind of finish, to have some idea what I'm going to do for closing.
So we're going to take a quick break and then we're going to see what the story is. And we'll talk about it tomorrow.
I guess they're not going down yet. Yeah.
Imagine that I have a long evening ahead of me, and I would prefer, I don't know how long, or if the court isn't going to give us any kind of time limits for the argument stage.
Why would I do that?
Because it would be reasonable. But
How about
in my
10
humble
minutes?
opinion, I would say, what?
How about 10 minutes?
If you go 20 for everybody, 20 minutes each, I would be happy with 20.
Yeah, good luck.
Okay, so, you know, you can
I
ask.
haven't met a lawyer yet that can introduce himself in 20 minutes, let alone argue.
Judge,
But I
I've
know you
practiced in
can.
front of you for 30 years, and it takes me 20 minutes to clear my throat, but I would manage it. Can I ask that instead of starting for closing arguments at 9:30 tomorrow, that we entertain the possibility that we start at 1:30?
No. No, what?
Kidding me? We'll never finish.
Not even close to possible. 1:30.
10:30?
8:30.
No, I have a bit of a docket, but that's really good. 10:30 will work. That's okay.
Thank you. 10:30.
Can I shut down?
Yes, you can, and we do have a few things before
That
that.
was like Lyndon Johnson in the Vietnam War. He said, I need 300,000 troops. Everyone went, oh my God, he would have told me only 200,000. Oh!
I mean, I can say